This is a parking lot where total cars are taken after an accident. In terms of this, is a special parking lot. In some of these cars, people survived and are now doing paperwork with insurance, thinking about a new car. And in some of these cars, life has stopped forever. A terrible picture. But after all, a broken car does not really surprise us. All of us as drivers periodically see such things on highways and in cities. Sometimes along some particularly dangerous sections of our roads or at traffic police posts at the entrance to the city. Such a broken car is put on a pedestal with the inscription "Galaxy of Danger." Don't drive, or you'll be the same. And somewhere else in Russia, I saw such a large metal bottle in which several broken cars were lying inside. Like, don't drink broken cars, it's bad for your health. At the same time, even if you are not a driver, you are unlikely to be able to hide from the sight of decomposed cars. Videos with accidents on the registrar have been one of the most viewed on the Runet for 10 years. Before going to bed, this is such a sight. To see how someone breaks to death there, or to fantasize how you would heroically resolve this situation. At the right moment, I would have noticed the danger. I would have used the steering wheel and pedals correctly. Yes, I really like it. I do the same myself. We also watch porn. Here I would be in his place like this op, and here like this op. But think for a second, what happens in your head when you meet a car smashed in saliva? Well, how do you react internally to a loud headline about an accident on the road, a video on the internet? Yes, that's all. For example, my initial reaction is always about this format. Well, someone somewhere when you crashed. Fuckers. Or the more fuckers, the fewer fuckers. But when you get to a place like this, thoughts appear a little different. Then you realize that this is not some special case of some individual person, but a terrible conveyor, like Timothy's Clip's conveyor. In place of this car, there were many others. And this particular piece of iron is not here forever. He will soon be taken away somewhere there, and another will take his place. And the tow truck driver with an absolutely casual expression comes here, unloads the car, and after a while, goes for another customer. And when you are here, you already have another thought in your head. Wait, but there are no people who wake up on Tuesday morning and think, what a wonderful day. I'm going to crash to death on my way to work today. Well, no kidding. Intentionally, no one wants to get into an accident, not a single mentally healthy person. Someone might say now, yes, look at how everyone drives. Eptat, some suicides and kamikazes on the roads. It's like an open day at a local mental hospital. Yes, maybe someone drives like a fool, but believe me, even such people do not think that they will get into an accident. They don't think they can crash. More precisely, they can say that, yes, I understand that I can crash, so what do I do now? Deny yourself the pleasure of driving. A brick may fall on my head tomorrow, and what am I supposed to do now? Not to leave the entrance because of this. And even though they talk like that, but in fact, deep down, they don't believe that they can crash. They believe in something else. They believe that they will cope, react, have time to taxi. After all, they are the kings of car control. They also know how a car behaves beyond traffic regulations, beyond social norms, and at the limit of the laws of physics. And that's why they can. They think that they are better at this than all the other drivers. After all, the rest do not know what it is to enter a turn at 120 kilometers per hour in a skid, and they know and regularly practice it at interchanges in the city. And that's why they're safe. That's how they think. And as we can see from this place, it doesn't always work. Perhaps the man in that car thought he had everything under control. Most likely he thought so, as this driver was in full control of the situation. How all the drivers in this parking lot thought everything was fine. Literally a couple of seconds before the collision, they thought exactly that. But in addition to the riders behind the wheel, there are people who are not to blame for anything. The injured party. The average hospital is about half of it all. Innocent people who also thought for a couple of seconds before that they had everything under control. And for some reason, what happened to them. Not with a car that was driving in front, behind, or in the next row, but with this one. The most accurate description of such a situation is that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I have a question. And could this driver not be in this place and at this time? Remember, when we find ourselves in a car with some driver at the wheel, we immediately understand whether it smells fried or not. At the same time, he can go plus or minus according to the rules, observing 60 kilometers per hour in the city. Just do it between the rows in traffic, and you immediately instinctively check whether you have fastened your seatbelt or not. And you realize that you will not be able to sleep on the way with such a driver. And again, it happens that when someone gets into an accident, you are absolutely not surprised and are like, oh well, everything was clear with this for a long time. At least he's alive himself. At the same time, there are drivers who have been driving for 20 years and have never been in an accident. And this also does not surprise anyone from those people who traveled with this person passenger. Still, oh, well yes, it's Vasily Vasilyevich, it's Vasil. What am I all about? It turns out that it is still possible to drive in such a way as to reduce the likelihood of getting into an accident to a minimum or even to zero. And this then is how. By the rules, or by the rules of real life. Have all of us been told in driving school, or by other drivers, that there are some traffic rules on the exam, and others in real life? Or do you need to drive according to some other rules at all? And anyway, who came up with these rules? And are the rules the same all over the world? And if they are not the same, then where are they better? That's all I can tell you. I have a story here about this, from which you will learn today how people drove cars before the advent of traffic rules, and why pedestrians rebelled against pedestrian crossings and drivers drove red. How did the clown show help save people's lives? And why did people walk under the wheels of cars in the center of Moscow? How is a hair straightener connected to intersections? And how did a member of a secret society issue his own traffic rules? Why does Vision Zero really exist? And why, in 20 years of its existence, no country in the world has been able to implement it? How are we being manipulated on the roads? And why is there a circular motion? Why are there different speed limits all over the world? And which ones are better? And why are Russian roads more dangerous than in the rest of the world? And whether, purely in theory, the day may come when not a single person will die on our roads. Let's first define one rule. I'm going to swear in this video. I warn you right away, not a solid text, but in the right places, the meaningless vocabulary will slip through. I intentionally left a checkmate in this video because I believe that if one word, or even several, can bring you out of psychological balance as a person, then I think that you don't fucking do driving a car. Such a position. I made this video for motorists. And if you are the person who takes responsibility for his life and the lives of other people when he gets behind the wheel of a car, but at the same time, the word dick can bring you out of balance, then we get out of the car, sit on the bike and go ahead, please. Just don't forget to remove the seat. And if you are like, oh, how am I such a useful material, but how am I going to show you to the children with a mat? This is also not an argument, since I will tell here how people are smeared on surfaces with their guts out. With a historical retrospective, please note, at some point, we will even compare with you how the guts flew through the walls earlier and today. And if your child is already big enough to watch such material, then it certainly knows about the word fuck, let's be honest. Most likely, they are already practicing with might and main, and you just don't know. I checked. I like to start serious material with such cringe jokes. What can I do about it? But so be it. Jokes about pedophilia, let's put aside for now. Let the fry grow up. That's what I want to say before we start. This material is very important to me personally. Everything I'm going to tell you today was not done with someone's support, not because someone asked us, not because the traffic police leadership personally came to me with a soldering iron for a deep conversation, and so on. All that motivated us when creating this material, as well as the material with me, is our hearts, which do not care about what is happening on our roads. This material can be considered a continuation of our Burr stories about car security systems. 75 minutes, and you're going to buckle up. If you haven't seen it, then be sure to take a look. And if you haven't watched it, then don't worry. We won't need the context of the previous one for this material. I specifically wrote it in such a way that it was understandable by itself. And yes, You can use both films anywhere and in any way, just like all our Burr stories. In fact, if this material and the material with the seatbelt begin to be shown in driving schools, there will be one more rather decorated head in this world. I hope that this will be useful for our roads. Meanwhile, you can make yourself comfortable, put out the lights in the room, and dive with us. There are a lot of interesting things ahead of you, and we will start, as usual, from the beginning. My mom always said that life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what kind of filling will come across. That's how I remember now. She tells me that if today you got a tasteless one with cognac or a squirrel is disgusting, then tomorrow will definitely be sweet. You know, I've had a lot of these squirrels in my life. I also fell down the sled, turned over and got into accidents. And Chernobyl was there. And when the Union broke up in the 91st, the schizo began there in general. But life has taught me to be ready for anything. There is a solution to all the hardships in my suitcase. Here, for example, different crosswords, Sudoku. I went for a ride on a Ferris wheel in Zhytomyr in my youth. We have, you know how beautiful it is there. Luxury, Zhytomyr. I sat down in a booth, and I was lifted to the very top, and there bam. And an accident. Yeah, they took me down. You know what? It turned out there was no accident. That I was just thin in my youth, like a match, like my little finger. So the controller didn't notice me. The attraction turned off and left. So I sat there for 8 hours, swaying. That's when I realized that I had to carry Sudoku and crosswords everywhere with me. And then you know, you can mow in 8 hours out of boredom at all. Well, my pride is a diamond. The ball is magical. Sometimes I'll ask him, honey. That's more useful in the household fishing rod than a new vacuum cleaner. Yes, but is it worth investing the entire pension in the crypt? Absolutely. So that's it. I got into an accident. Hunters are saints. He hit his swallow. Shar, should I go anywhere? Yes. Grandpa, wait, first of all, your balloon always shows only yes. How is it always? Well, look. Sharp, is there a world government? Yes, and I always knew. Here's what I'm telling you. If you are in an accident, then you need to consult not with a balloon, but ask for help from people who understand this, and who specialize in it. And the guys from Tinkov Insurance can help you, and advise you about it for free. They have a roadside assistance project right now. Services from Tink Insurance are completely free, and at the same time they can be used by the client of absolutely any insurance company, and they will help him. They now have 10 bright specially prepared Mitsubishi 200 from Tinkoff Insurance driving around the city. Here, by the way, is one of them. Let's go show you. Tinkoff Insurance employees will help you to issue a Euro protocol, fix the place of the accident, and explain what to do and in what sequence. Plus, they will tell you how to receive payments and much more. And also, at the same time, they will save you a lot of time and help you not to make a mistake with the documents. And if their car was not nearby, you can always call them on the hotline. By the way, do you have a phone? Yes. Let me write it down. Oh, you have an Instagram here. If you see somewhere else in the city, such a Mitsubishi or 200 a Tinkoff Insurance, then you can lay out a story with a Tinkoff bank mark and get 10% cash back for fuel on the Tinkoff card. At the same time, you can participate in this action as many times as you want. And the link? Will there be a link in the description? Yes. For more information about roadside assistance from Tinkoff Insurance, follow the link in the description. Grace. In our documentaries, we always start our narrative with a dick from where. At least for 120 years, we precisely rewind the film back and begin to unwind the events further. In Japan, we started from the 19th century, in France in general from the 17th. But In this material you can relax. Since the issue of an accident is an actual thing, we definitely won't have to dig far today, I thought when I sat down for the script. So, Gaius Julius Caesar. Guys, this is where we start today. An hour quickly scattered with a couple of thousand years. Don't worry. Caesar, a great commander, politician, dictator of the Roman Empire and salad. He lived before our era. In addition to the fact that the Roman Empire conquered half of the world and left a huge mark on history, they were the very first on Earth to face problems with roads, stupidly due to the fact that they were the first in the world to start building them in large numbers, the foundation of any empire. This is the army with which you, in fact, capture new territories and protect the old ones. In order for you to have a large and strong army, you need what? A strong economy to pay for this whole banquet. All infantry, cavalry, officers. It's fucking expensive. Not only do you need to feed them all, they all need to pay salaries, buy armor, weapons, and so on down the list. In the economies of empires, military spending could easily account for half of the entire budget, or even more. In order to spend up to a fig and more money on the army, you should, in principle, have up to a fig of money. And to do this, you need your goods and resources to move back and forth across the country as quickly as possible. The faster the goods traffic, the faster the resources will flow from the colonies to the capital. And the faster you can send goods for trade with other countries, the more you will earn both profits and taxes. And you will be able to maintain a larger army in order to seize even more land, so that you will be paid more taxes, and more goods will be given in the form of tribute, and you can use this money to hire and maintain even more soldiers, and so on in a circle. Well, basically, I think you understand. The Romans, of course, also understood this, otherwise they would not have been an empire. Therefore, we worked, in fact, on our economy. With the sea connection, everything was clear in general. Expand ports in coastal cities, build trade here, and they will find their way there somehow. But there were questions about communications by land between cities. There are no roads, only some local trails, and we must understand that an increase in speed by at least a couple of kilometers per hour for a cart with a load, which is dragged by a donkey, is a serious achievement at that time. It was necessary to measure the speed of movement at that time by the speed of the wagon train, since it is the slowest. Roughly speaking, the average speed of a loaded wagon train over rough terrain, 2 or 3 kilometers per hour, and on a smooth paved road, a donkey can already drag at a speed of 4 kilometers per hour. Plus, he gets tired less, since it's easier to drive on the road than just over rocks and a field, and he will be able to move for one day longer. Therefore, the construction of even just some poor track almost doubled the speed of movement of goods over land. Donkeys, of course, did not much welcome such innovations, but no one asked them. Therefore, in fact, the Romans took care of roads between cities and even between countries, and I must say, they did it very well. Firstly, they built according to the mind. There was a whole technology with the right pillows, a base there, and so on. The guys spent a lot of money on it, and the roads were standing for a very long time. So long that some sites are still alive, unlike the Roman Empire. They even take excursions on them. They say, look, we can whenever we want. Don't ask why we have a time of the road right now. Everything is in holes. Let's go to the next exhibit. Secondly, they built a lot. Have you heard the expression, all roads lead to Rome? So, they really led into it. There were 5 main directions: to Asia, Byzantium, Spain, Germany with Britain, and Africa. At that time, this is really almost all the roads on the planet. And from all these directions, people, wagons, cargo, troops, artisans, slaves, there flocked to Rome, as to the capital of the empire, and so on. The guys have set up roads. Well done, yes. But with Rome itself, a hitch came out. It was built before the country became an empire, and before all the resources from all over the empire poured into it. And from the experience of modern life, you and I are already aware that if we direct huge traffic flows to a city that is not ready for this, then what will happen? Everything will stand up tight there. Yo. You won't surprise us with such a state of affairs today. But Guy Yulievich was notable for how quickly the capital turned into one big traffic jam, and a mess of people, horses, words, cattle, and that's all. Caesar did not count on the fact that he would invent traffic jams first of all in modern Moscow. You know, as I did not expect that it would become a salad, but life is an unpredictable thing. Really damn, how much irony there is in the expression that Caesar was chopped into a salad. It was impossible to go anywhere in the city, especially the honorable gentlemen. In front of any important person at that time, there was a whole bunch of slaves who simply pushed people and animals aside, so that the master could calmly go about his business with the boys to the tea house. The city administration and the great emperor looked at all this bacchanalia and did not understand what to do with it. That something needs to be done. It was understandable, but how to solve the problem is not quite. Actually, as it always happens with people who come up with something new for the first time. I do not know what was the trigger for maintaining the rules of the road. History is silent. Maybe someone important was crushed. Maybe a lot of important people were crushed. Maybe some kind of conflict happened between the merchants and the Dick understand. But anyway, Gaius Julius Caesar, the author of the first rules of the road, if they could be called such, since they, in general, were quite uncomplicated. Firstly, it was forbidden to enter the territory of the city on horseback on any animal, even on Negroes, and even on chariots. It doesn't matter if you are a local or a visitor, in any case, you leave your vehicle in the parking lot in front of the city gates, and go inside on your own 2 feet. Or, if you fall into a trap on your own 2 feet, you can use the official city-hired palanquin with slaves. Well, that is, riding Negroes. And these were the first in history about the images of modern intercepting parking lots and city taxis. The logic here is not difficult to understand. When you have a crowded city, you need to save space. And a man on his own 2 feet takes up much less space on the street than a man on a chariot, which is harnessed to a horse. Or even a few. It was possible to get inside the city on your cart only on weekends or on some stormy holidays. Even at night on a working day, you could only come in with a pass and then for a few hours. Secondly, a special service was established to resolve conflicts, disputes, and other hemorrhoids on the road. Well, something like modern traffic cops. In fact, a detachment was simply singled out from the city guard who served at busy intersections, squares, and beat up any person who created a traffic jam. Most often, merchants who dragged their cattle for sale on market day received a blow on the head. You brought 3 cows, they blocked half of the street with their asses, and the whole city stood up. Therefore, the guys usually came with 1 cow, and the rest were left under the supervision of guards at the gates of the city. And they sold, in fact, 1 at a time, or told customers that we still have there. Let's go to the gate, I'll show you. Such an uncomplicated solution, but it worked. There were no rules for the rest of the empire. The need was only in Rome. Even in other large cities, in other countries, nothing like this existed, since only Rome was so big, as there was nothing like this after Rome until the Middle Ages, since there was no need, and there were no such large cities. Well, here we are again in some kind of hole. How are we going to find anything at all? If you don't stop whining, we'll be discovered before we even find the door. Kids, how do we find the door? With these plans of yours, it doesn't always turn out to be one thing. But do you remember, my sister's husband called us to work. Now, we have been a manager for a long time and bought all the cars. The second focus. Or we can buy a Mazda 6. Let's move on. So, we have reached Platinum, remember? Yes. Calmly went in, took what they wanted and left. No noise. Yeah. I've only watched one movie like this. The robbers came, and then they were raped. And they weren't women. Throw it off, then I'll take a look. I really like this. How long have you been there? Now wait. Come on quickly. No, oh, well, I understand, born, all that. Hope with a hardware store. I wish you hadn't found it. Somehow, though, why aren't you always on the negative side? Here it is with this one here. I'm trying actually. Yes, I'm negative, because plans always catch us. Not because of my moms, but in spite of. Come on. Listen, there's junk here. Don't touch anything superfluous. Oh really? Be quiet, little one. That's it, I'll check it out myself. To me here. Oh, I'm being fucked here. What are you doing here? How? Well, you said to wait. I'm waiting for fashion. With a buzz. Are you kidding me? But we didn't break into the house for you to smoke a hookah on a double apple. Come on. Let's go, let's go. I've already figured it all out. Here they are, the armor of trends. It remains only to take them. Well, hello. And you're here. Yes, we were just walking by and thought, why not come in? With lockpicks. What lockpicks? Me. I told you, he's a psychic. He has X-ray eyes there. He sees us without clothes. So wait, what kind of X-ray? You've fallen for absolutely all the sensors in the house. I have yaks everywhere. What? Hung up? Ajax. This is a professional wireless security system, not the point. First you got caught on the street motion sensor from the motion camera to the door, and then you entered the house, and the door opening sensor suddenly leaked, and at the same time, they immediately ran into a motion sensor with a motion cam camera in the hallway. Well, we decided to make a surprise, and that's why the water was spilled, and at the same time, they immediately ran into a leak sensor, and by the way, it was not necessary to score a hookah. What kind of hookah? Which would activate the smoke and carbon monoxide sensor if you started smoking it, hanging there on the ceiling, and then the siren would have screamed all over the house. And by the way, Lek, what you saw on the wall, there is a keyboard, a cape, for controlling the entire system. And the most interesting thing, by the way, you missed, there's a hub 2+ hanging there. This is the central part of the system, which communicates with all sensors via its own radio protocol of the Jebel, at a distance of up to 2 kilometers, by the way. Supports for independent communication channels of 2 SIMs, internet and Wi-Fi, and with a built-in battery for up to 15 hours, transmits all alarms directly to the smartphone, even if the whole house is de-energized. Why are you telling us all this? Ajax also has controlled sockets. Plug the socket into the socket, and that's it. Now you can turn it on and off remotely. And the design of devices and standard security systems. The devices have a general minimalistic style, so they fit easily into any interior. It seems to me that he switched to the advertising sys mode. Ajax is a professional solution for the security of your home, office, garage, and so on. Also here you can connect to the security console, sign a contract with a security company, so that in case of an alarm, in a few minutes, the staff will come to you. We grab the suit and run, and the life of the sensors from the built-in batteries is from 2 to 7 years. And that's how the panic button works. In the description, you will find an exclusive link to Ajax, according to which you will receive a 10% discount on the starter kit. Damn it. The alarms are digital, and the employee is quite analog. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it was around the end of the 4th century AD. The whole of Europe was gradually transformed from barbaric and slave-owning feudal societies. For our perspective on history, what is a feudal society? This is, in fact, a fucking mountain of small feudal lords who owned the land and were sovereign rulers on it. And accordingly, they built up and organized everything on the ground the way the left heel itches. There was no consistency, and roads and cities were all built as if on a high. If in the Roman Empire, cities were built at least according to some general concepts, then until the 15th, 16th centuries, Europe was built up in general. You don't understand how, and no one was worried about it. Roughly speaking, what is a medieval city? What is in Europe? What is in Russia? On a hill, or on the bank of some river, you have a fort with fortified walls, or a castle of rather small size. Important guys and governing elites are sitting inside, and ordinary people live in settlements around this fort. The city itself could not feed itself in any way. It produced practically nothing, so it was fed just here, by the settlement around it, in exchange for the fact that when some enemies attacked, all the villagers fell outside outside the walls of the city, and fought back with the whole crowd there. And after the enemies received the cradle and dumped, people got out of the fort and restored everything around that the long-awaited guests had burned and destroyed. And in fact, due to the fact that 1.5 diggers lived in the city on a permanent basis, and the whole city in diameter could be walked in 10 minutes, there were no problems inside. And it is quite difficult to create a traffic jam in the village and in the field. Problems arose only with the troops when it was necessary to move a hefty crowd of people to a neighboring country to get the local population out. But we won't get into military navigation and logistics today. We don't need it, believe me. Humanity had to be seriously puzzled by the question of the rules of urban travel, and in general the rules of travel anywhere, with the birth of manufacturing, and with the birth of my beloved capitalism. And this is just a conditional there, like the 16th century. Up to this point, the entire production of all goods and food, roughly speaking, was divided into two types. The first one, this is a natural economy in the village and in the surrounding area. Here, roughly speaking, what has grown around the fence, we eat and sell, and fertilize after. The second type is handicraft production. The blacksmith dad and his blacksmith son knocked out a couple of units of something there in their forge, and that's what they sell. It is not difficult to bring it to the market in your hands. It was much more difficult not to sleep with so much entertainment, and it was possible to hobble to the market somehow, even if he's already drunk. At the end of the feudal system, people in their own mass reached the manufactories. Manufactories are the prototype of modern industrial plants or any other enterprises that produce some standardized pieces. Merchants and artisans gradually began to unite in groups in order to do business much more efficiently. Artisans took assistants under their command, to whom they gave some pieces of the production process. And merchants who had good capital invested money in raw materials for production and supplied it to such production groups, and then took over the sale of finished products. The profit with this whole operation was divided by how to negotiate. In short, several concepts began to form in parallel with each other. The first is wage labor. Before the manufactories, for the most part, all labor was slave labor. Either they were straight natural slaves, who had rights approximately at the level of animals, or peasants who seemed to be already human, but in fact did not differ much from slaves. And then, a form of employment appeared, that a person has some kind of work, for which, it seems, money is even paid, and even some specific place of work where you work. What is important for our picture here is that there is a noticeable layer of people who live in one place and work in another, and so, every day you need to go somewhere to work and come back home. Well, he also tells everyone in a row that it would be better to go to the factory to work. These guys. The second concept is the centralization of production. Production was no longer smeared with a bunch of small local home rooms, but were concentrated in large united centers. And this means that a large volume of raw materials must be delivered to the same place. And then, a large volume of products must be taken away. Plus, large warehouses for goods began to appear, for which transport is also needed, and the opportunity to take something to it, and take something from it. And it can no longer be done on one crooked cart, with a crooked mare, or with your hands, but you need a lot of transport. Especially if the company produces something big, heavy. For example, guns. The third concept, prioritization of travel. Since the manufactories, first of all, produced something for the military industry, and these are strategically important goods for the state, it is impossible to allow such a situation, that because of some dude with a cow on the street, the process of delivering raw materials or finished goods was slowed down. Someone's cow has shit itself and died in the middle of the street, and because of this, a whole ship is standing and waiting for goods to be delivered to it for loading. And at this moment, the whole of Europe, which was built up and organized, like in the feudal era, fucked up together, since all major cities began firm and distro with the transport system. In fact, the guys faced exactly the same problems that were in Rome during the time of Caesar, only evenly throughout the continent. Plus, another unexpected person drove up from the other end. By the other end, I mean the maritime trade, and not what usually comes from the other end. The 16th century. This is the beginning of the expansion of Europeans around the world. Magellan and his circumnavigation of the world, all the great geographical discoveries of the 15th, 17th centuries. When people in Europe learned that there was Africa, India, America, that's all. Europe has not yet had time to guess that Negroes, Indians, and Indians are also people. But I realized very quickly that you can make good money on these funny little animals. Maritime trade began to develop at lightning lightning speed, and trading empires began to form, and then colonies around the world. And all this together meant that the trade turnover on the sea routes grew exponentially, dozens of times. To say that the city ports were awesome, nothing to say. Even if they managed to rebuild and expand under the growing flow of ships, it was still a task to push goods further into the city, to warehouses or production facilities. There, even without ports, the streets quietly choked themselves. And then there's you with your spices, silk, and concubines. Although concubines still managed to push through, and in concubines, pretty quickly, it became clear to everyone that the biggest problems arise from two situations. The first is if someone quickly drives his cart through the streets and loses control due to the fact that the horses were carried, or the fool himself, due to the fact that there is a grandfather lost control, he crashed somewhere or into someone, laid out on the first road, and blocked the way to everyone who somehow tried to drive across the street. The second, if someone is just terribly stupid, either driving very slowly, or just lying in the middle of the road. The second situation was solved very simply. All the riders and riders could whip all the peasants who climb under the hooves, and thus clear their way. But with the first situation, nothing can be done so easily. Yes, a person who has laid out a cart in the middle of the road can be whipped quite calmly afterwards. That's what everyone did, yes, a fact. But how to make sure that a person does not initially get into such a situation, it's not clear, since at that moment, in almost all states, everything was regulated by the will of monarchs, czars, and other dictators. You can dig up a lot of funny decrees. For example, in Russia, the very first way of the rules of the road was the decree of Peter the Great of 1683, which forbade driving without drivers, and on unbridled horses. The driver, it's just a professional coachman. If a person knew how to drive horses normally, then the probability of demolishing half the city on his cart fell greatly. A wild horse. This is actually an unmanageable horse. Well, mad there, like some kind of naughty. If you get into the dictionary, then the word unbridled means reached to the extreme limits of debauchery. But it is unlikely that Peter the Great had anything against depraved horses. All those who listened ride quietly and calmly. The decree prescribed exile to penal servitude. In general, a cool practice. You quickly rode around the city on a frisky horse, and then just as quickly and briskly went to carry stones in Siberia. In the 1730th year, Empress Anna issued a decree that said something like this: cabbies and other people of all ranks should ride with horses in harness, with all fear and caution, quietly, and those who will not comply with their rules be whipped and exiled to penal servitude. What is calmly, with all fear and caution, is not entirely clear to me personally. But the fact that you will get a whip on the ass for non-compliance is quite understandable. And so on. In all the countries of Europe in the same way, all the traffic rules at that time were reduced to the fact that I was here at attention, or we would be kicked out. No one in the whole world has thought of anything more effective. In general, such decrees were enough to solve the problem with the passage of commercial vehicles, if you can call it that. Everyone who gets in the way was beaten with a whip, and everyone who drives fast was waiting for the same thing. It should be understood that although there were problems with traffic, but some carts and carriages existed only at enterprises, the state and high-ranking gentlemen. 99% of the city's people moved on their own 2 feet, and at least for some kind of traffic device, such rules and decrees were quite enough. Yes, there have been cases when someone runs over someone somewhere on a busy street. It also happened that someone was laid out to death by himself. But in general, these were isolated cases, and everyone scored on them. Real shit. It began with the appearance of this monster, Ford Model. Everything started with him in the automotive world, and a lot of things are due to the appearance of this car. Firstly, by the time the Ford Model T appeared, human deaths on the road were already a frequent occurrence. We talked about how people began to understand that a car is dangerous, in fact, in our documentary for 75 minutes. And you will buckle up. How engineers and the dead saved human lives. It's about the development of car safety systems. But we will also talk about death in this article. Don't worry, from death in this life, you will not fucking get anywhere, and we as martyrs will go to heaven. Secondly, the sales volume of Ford Model T is growing at an incredible pace, and if earlier, absolutely the entire human history from the invention of the wheel to the Ford Model T, all vehicles on the planet, this is either for the army or for trade and economy, that is, commercial transport, Then with the advent of Ford Model T, the term personal mobility appeared. Starting from 1906 and up to the present time, for the first time in history, a person has the opportunity to buy a huge heavy cart with a motor that can accelerate quickly on its own and, if desired, kill other people to death. Just to go about my business. Not because you carry cargo for the company. Not because this transport is used for military or state needs. And not because you are driving the carriage of some honorable gentleman with a responsible task, but just like that, for a buzz. And on the one hand, personal mobility. This is a magnificent thing that the 20th century gave to man. But on the other hand, personal mobility was a very big problem. And here we need to take a closer look. This is a song about two sisters, Ja and Davia, who fell out of favor with the evil Sultan Akin. Navia, we can't escape, but is the lamp that Vijaya's mother gave nearby. Of course, Jew. Ja, he's very, very close. What to do with the Paul? Jay and Noor are in trouble. Jane, help me for not reaching. And at him. And I will help. Get started. Jin, we're in trouble. How hard it is to talk on the run. You help us escape from the Sultan. I'm angry, I'll grab you and eat you like a sheep. And Navia, your legs, but not faster than the Sultan's horses. To escape from him, you need a reliable car that can be found on Avito. Jay, this is an ancient prediction about Avito, a place with thousands of ricks for every taste. Wonderful chariots are being sold in this luxurious bazaar, so you can choose them at a reasonable price, yes to our lusts. They will carry us away as the moon carried away the sun. But Jin, how will we understand that the rickshaw sent from the legendary Avito is not a trick of the evil Sultan, that it does not belong to his guards, that the previous cabman watched her like a mother watches a child, that he loved her as a husband loves his wife, and that the self-propelled chariot will not let us down, and that she would take us away from him faster than the wind, like a zealous horse. You will be convinced by checking the history of the car in the car library. Oh, Jean, I can't describe your miracles. Tell us what this magic car library is. Ja and Noor. There is no time to delay. While we were singing our beautiful songs and dancing beautiful dances, I found the perfect carriage for you. Our National Land Rover MOs of state agencies from the report of the auto library whispered that he had two owners who loved the chariot, as Risha loved Vasia and Davia. As soon as a stone fell from the road onto the windshield, the cart was taken straight to the master. The mileage of the car is as pure as your souls, and the guards of Sultan Akado did not touch it. She is red as passion, and faster than all the horses from the Sultan's army. Hurry up, run to the car, and I'll detain the Sultan. Muter same jit. So, let honor be given everywhere. Before buying a car on Avito, buy a report. Well, the evil Sultan, the doctor will bring a stretcher. By a rickshaw smart on Savita's car library, in the description of the link. How do you imagine the cities and roads in the cities of the USA, of the sample of 1910s, 20s, 30s, That's the question for you. At least, something from The Great Gatsby or the Mafia game immediately comes to my mind when you have such free streets. People mostly walk, and you drive a car in absolute freedom. There are very few cars physically. Roads were built with a margin, so if you had the opportunity to buy absolutely any personal car, then you automatically became the king of the road, since you had practically no competitors on this road. Yes, you can safely draw about such a picture in your head, and then revel in nostalgia for the past time, which you will never get into. And in fact, this picture is not much different from the past reality. If you owned your own car at that time, then you had a really large phantom pofigism. But the fact that you alone had it like this is a big misconception. I have checked all the pofigism, and I can responsibly declare it, trust me. Here is a selection of some interesting facts, especially for you. San Francisco. This is the central city of Northern California. At the time of the beginning of the 10th years, there were 10,000 carriages or other vehicles drawn by horses. There were some insignificant number of cars for the conditional 1910th year. Further, in 4 years, in 1914th year, the number of cars equaled horse transport. In 1916, after only 2 years, there were already 26,000 cars. And 8 years later, in 1924, the number of cars in San Francisco exceeded 100,000 pieces. And this is with a population of about 500,000 people. Of course, such exponential growth was not only in San Fran, but throughout the country. Between the 1914th and 1920th years, in many cities, the growth of car registration exceeded the growth of the population. In New York, not to be confused with New York, new cars appeared 3 times more often than new people. In Brooklyn, this difference was 6 times, in Buffalo 7 times, and in St. Louis, as many as 9 times the number of new cars exceeded the number of new people registered. Don't ask me why they compare such strange indicators. I don't know myself. But Americans quite often count some simple things in a very tricky way. It is especially very strange that they count calories there, judging by the population. The most important thing that is clear from these statistics is that there were suddenly more cars and more, and no one was ready for this. Plus, here's to you even before the exercise. We take our imaginative out of the dusty closet and start imagining. Just imagine, you are leaving your house in your car in the morning for the city, and as soon as you are on the road, they tell you on the radio that from now on there is no priority travel rule. No one should give in to anyone. No one goes on the main or secondary, since there are no main and secondary ones anymore, and never have been. The hefty avenue and the adjacent shallow path from the courtyards are absolutely equivalent in right-of-way. And if, while you are driving your 60 kilometers per hour along the avenue, someone gets out of the yards across the road, then this is a normal situation. No one is violating anything. And if you suddenly bump into someone, or someone, flying out of the neighboring streets, crashes into you, no one will be to blame for anything. It's just that such derivators are obtained. Come on, feel the horror of such traffic around the city, when anyone can fly in from any side. And you need to constantly monitor absolutely every corner. There is not even a right-hand rule. No one should concede anything to anyone anywhere. Terrifying, but people used to drive like that. At the time when the automotive world was born, there was no dig. Roads were just roads, and cars were just cars. You could easily go to the store, buy a car, and drive yourself anywhere. No one cared if you could drive it or not. Just here's a car for you, and welcome to the road. And if you put all this on the picture, that you and I already know, that there were big problems with traffic in large cities, we will get just an absolutely hellish mixture that will give a light to any modern traffic problems. The most striking example of hell on the roads was New York, of course. In 1913, there were morning and evening traffic jams in the city every day. This is the first city on the planet where everything got up twice a day, stable according to the schedule. The speed of traffic in the center of cars was lower than that of pedestrians. The metro reported every year that the passenger flow in the subway was increasing faster than population growth, which indicated that there was no way to get anywhere on land transport. The tram parks of New York echoed the guys from the subway that yes, everyone have arrived, dry the rails. the average tram speed in the center has almost halved due to traffic jams. And this meant that in the mid-50s in New York, the tram was moving slower than the horse-drawn teams that it had once replaced. In 1920, the authorities of New York estimated that in 1 year, the bridges connecting Manhattan with the rest of the city passed through 92 million cars, which carried 204 million passengers. Manhattan is the historic center of New York, in case you don't know. And let's do it again, so that you can properly assimilate the figure. 1920th, not 2020th. This is 100 years ago from the present time. And 92 million cars passed through the city center, and 204 million passengers. We currently have 60 million cars, trucks, buses, and other things on wheels in the whole country, and 144 million citizens. And 100 years ago, traffic and passenger traffic passed through the Manhattan bridges in New York, 1.5 times more than all the people and cars in our country combined. These are roomy bridges. If you know what I mean, it is clear that the same car was counted twice in these statistics, at the entrance and at the exit. And if the car drove back and forth around the city, it could get into the statistics several times a day. But still, whatever one may say, the figure is monstrous. Especially in 1920th year, the city and the entire transport system were, to put it mildly, in permanent surprise. And not only in New York, but all over the country. The situation was complicated not only by the fact that there were more and more cars, but also by the fact that people began to use the car noticeably more often. Every year, the average distance of one trip fell. And this means that people didn't walk around any bullshit and around any corner, but drove a wheelbarrow, if there was such an opportunity. And by the way, why the car has become much more convenient for everyday use, just in the 1920th year. We told in a documentary about oil, ecology, electric cars. A hint for those who saw. At that time, an electric starter appeared, and by the 20th, it was already on all new cars. You didn't have to twist the starter curve, break your hands, just sat down, started, and drove like a modern car. Naturally, the situation with terrible traffic and traffic jams did not suit anyone. Residents of the center complained that car horns were constantly screaming under the windows. Businesses were leaving the city center en masse and leaving for the outskirts, as neither customers nor employees could simply get to offices and shops. And the authorities were blown away by how inefficiently the city was working and how much potential profit the economy was losing due to a massive riser on the roads. In 1925, a certain Herbert Hoover, the chairman of commerce at that time, estimated that urban congestion caused losses to the economy of $2 billion a year. And $2 billion a year, especially in the 1920th year, is an amount that makes you take care of questions. But the joke is that no one understood what to do. You are the very first in the world to face a problem that no one else on the planet has ever faced before. There is nowhere to spy on the solution. Share experiences too. You have a global fuck-up from all over the country. Everyone is looking at you, and you're not in the tooth with your foot. But, as is usually the case in such situations, the decision came from nowhere. Meet me, I ask you to love and favor. William Phelps Eno. And I bet none of you have ever heard that name. And if you know who he is, then fuck his strange hobbies, I can tell you. Keep doing them, I like everything. William was just an ordinary citizen of the States. He was born into a wealthy family. His father was engaged in real estate and was an influential and wealthy uncle. Since early childhood, since the 1860s, William traveled with his parents around New York in a carriage, and was constantly in traffic jams like the whole city. Even before the appearance of a large number of cars in the city, some intersections or entire streets stood up here and there, purely due to the fact that the coachmen could not agree with each other, who was going in which queue, and who is driving along what trajectory, and so on. And William was constantly infuriated by it, right from an early age. In theory, William was supposed to continue his father's business in real estate management. He was sent to study at Williston Academy, and then to Yale University. But the situation on the roads did not give the guy peace of mind. William clearly understood that the problem lay in the a simple organization of the movement. It was necessary to make some small number of rules, just explain them to everyone, and make them comply, and then everything will go. You don't need a large staff of employees who regulate intersections. There is no need to expand roads, squares, but just take all drivers, explain some reasonable truths to them, and the situation will become much better. He discussed this problem with friends, with people from the city administration, with the police, but all the conversations always ended with the fact that yes, it would be cool if everyone somehow started driving through the streets consciously. Yes, yeah, that would be cool, yo. But nothing moved beyond the conversations. And I must say that William, even when he was studying at the university, became a member of the Skull and Bones Society. This is a secret student society, so secret that there is a huge article on Wikipedia about this organization. And with her there are a lot of conspiracy theories that there, behind closed doors, terrible collusions take place, and the fate of worlds is decided, like with a Masonic society. But at that moment, all that was happening behind closed doors was sending William under various pretexts, and in all possible directions. When he tried to talk to someone about roads, everyone wanted the roads to become usable, but to do something with their hands. These are not days. It's we're busy with important things here. This cigar won't finish smoking itself. Actually, in such a situation, you always have two ways. The first, traditional, just join the majority and dream along with everyone, whine, do nothing. The second, rare but correct way. This is to go into the pool with your head and start raking with your own hands. In such situations, the word pool is correctly read as a vat of shit. William thought that since there are no traffic rules, then I will create my own, with gestures and intersections. He watched the traffic for several years, wrote down situations in which drivers made mistakes in his notebook, in his opinion, collected all these facts together, systematized, and thought about how to make a clear and understandable instruction. As it seemed to William, the first thing to deal with is the chaotic movement of the driver inside the road. Psychologically, people are so arranged that it is always more comfortable to drive in the center of the road. Just remember how you drive along the lane, for example. You don't drive with the right or left wheel on the marking, do you? You try to stay in the middle, simply because it's more comfortable for the brain when you have the same distances on both sides. Or if we are driving on a one-way street without markings, where will we go? Also in the center, it just happens automatically. And what will happen if the concept of markings, lanes, and oncoming traffic is not as such? Everyone will drive in the center of the road, that's right, which is in one direction, which is in the other direction. And when they see an oncoming car, they will make maneuvers to separate somehow. Although the roads were initially calmly allowed to leave without maneuvering, if the drivers had initially kept to their own curve. For my part, and this rule, that cars should always keep to the right curb when driving, was the first and most important rule that William formulated. Before him, no one saw a problem in the fact that cars on the same road go into each other's faces, and at a close distance. They start to turn the steering wheels and drive away. Next is the intersection. Here, we had two problems that needed to be corrected, and both with turns. The first problem is turning to the right, the second to the left, as it is easy to guess. In both situations, the root of the problem was the same. People wanted to go to the center. For example, if a person turned to the right, he drove away along a larger radius than required, climbing into the trajectory under the wheels of a car that is traveling along an adjacent road. Roughly speaking, you are calmly driving down a street that comfortably accommodates two or more rows of cars. But when someone turns right from the adjacent road, you are under the wheels. The driver uses too much maneuvering space and just blocks your way, in such a way that it is, well, stupid not to go around. And because of this, you have to slow down all the traffic behind you, wait for everyone, until the person picks up speed, and so on. And if this driver initially turned, sticking to the same right curb as much as possible, then you could easily go around him without slowing down, and the two of you would not slow down the whole street. Therefore, this was the second important rule in William's document. With a left turn, the situation is exactly the same. People tried, on the contrary, to cut the distance by turning a little in advance and striving, again, to the center of the road, blocking the way in this way, immediately with the whole stream at the intersection. You get in the way of your oncoming traffic, and the left oncoming traffic, and the flow that comes from the right street. And if they were driving through the intersection, as we are used to now, driving a little further farther than the middle and turning left. Sticking to the right curb in the way shown in the diagram, they would interfere with a much smaller number of cars. In fact, in such a situation, you only interfere with the flow from the right street. Plus, the cutoff scheme at the main turn was dangerous because this way you can initially go into the turn at a higher speed, but after passing the intersection, you hit the curb at high speed, and you can fly out onto the sidewalk or into the wall if you don't calculate the speed at the entrance. As in fact, many did. It should be understood that the cars of the first samples were controlled very conditionally, and no one knew how to drive at all. And any situation or trajectory where a person can try to fit into a turn at high speed had to be slaughtered at the root. Therefore, in Williams' rules, simple diagrams were drawn on how to drive through the intersection. But how? Fuck. You don't need to in any case. In addition to simple and reasonable rules for where and how to keep the car on the road, William also came up with gestures when stopping or starting from a place that you need to raise your hand when you brake or start moving. Brake lights and turn signals then too, no one has yet come up with, if anything. He drew U-turn and parking schemes, and for the first time in the world, he came up with the right of priority passage for firefighters, police, postal, and medical vehicles. In his opinion, all drivers had to let these guys pass on the road and intersections, and also not block the street when parking or just standing, so that emergency vehicles could always drive down the street. For us in the modern world, these are some obvious postulates of the movement, and then it was just a break in patterns. Before William, no one had approached traffic regulation from such a point of view. But it's not enough to come up with rules. It's also necessary to make sure that everyone accepts them, understands, learns, and begins to fulfill them. And this is a completely different task, especially when you consider the fact that the number of people who could read elementary was quite limited. William finished work on the first version of the Rules of the Road in 1900, and he also wrote a separate book, Urgently Needed Traffic Reform, in which he described all the necessary actions that need to be taken to systematize the flows on the streets. Naturally, the first thing he did was go with all these pies to the New York Police Department, with the premise that the boys were organizing traffic normally. I'm late. Guess, with one traw. What did they say to him there? Naturally, he was told that this was all good, of course, but go on, the boy will take a walk, c'est dovo. Do not interfere with our work. It's a completely standard, normal reaction everywhere and always. But fortunately, William was a stubborn go. He filled the thresholds of all possible institutions, communicated with all important uncles, and tried to make himself heard by all possible methods. But it didn't work. In the end, it's so simple, guys, fuck, let's print these rules in the form of leaflets, hang them everywhere, and inform drivers that it's smarter and safer to drive with these methods. To which he was again answered, that's what you need, you type. And we don't have the money for that. You stay there, of course, but there's no money. And William went to type. He used his own money to print and post the rules all over the city. He hung them at all important intersections, in bars, at stadiums, and in all places where people were crowding in one way or another. 1.5 diggers can read from them skillfully. Yes, but William was trying to get through to someone. He personally traveled to all possible events for motorists, and spoke there with explanations of why the rules are important and necessary. And in fact, the only people who supported William at that time. These are car clubs. At the dawn of the automotive industry, automobile clubs were quite large venues with a serious level of influence on motorists. Since there were no other regulators stupidly, gradually, a little bit at a time, drivers began to listen to the voice of reason and began to follow the rules. And the government and the police began to notice that the rules really work. And when traffic goes a little more organized, it goes faster and the capacity of the streets increases. And what is more important, the accident rate is reduced. It seems that the rules of the road, especially in such a simple addition, are an obvious, logical, and very understandable thing that needs to be introduced right now. But it took William 9 years to be heard. He issued the rules in the 1900th year, and he received official support only in 1909, when the New York City government approved these rules as mandatory at the city level. Not all over the country, not in any state, but in one particular city. Anyway, William Phelps Ina is the man who gave the world the very first rules of the road for cars, and was able to bring this idea to life. After his rules were approved in New York, he naturally continued to work on traffic. In parallel with the process according to the rules, in 1903, he designed a roundabout on Columbus in Manhattan, and in fact, William came up with roundabouts in their modern form as such. It is clear that the squares existed before him, but there was always chaotic traffic. Aina was the first to systematize it in such a way that the movement was fast and safe. And according to his principles, and under his guidance, a circular movement was designed at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris and Piccadilly Circus in London. And then, his principles of traffic management began to be dragged around the world. In fact, Aina has been engaged all his life in implementing his ideas and rules, which he wrote in his book about traffic reform. And no matter what country in the world you are in, if you look out the window and look at the road, then cars will drive along it, according to the principles that grandfather Aina bequeathed to us. Keep to the right edge of the road in right-hand traffic, and the left edge of the road in left-hand traffic, along which trajectory you need to arrive at the intersection, and so on. But naturally, these rules could not solve all the problems that faced the organizers of traffic at that time. Yes, they were useful, but there were too many problems. And the good thing is that William is not the only person who was worried about traffic and who worked on it. Such a question to you. Which city comes to mind when we say the phrase American automotive industry? Detroit, right. As you can guess from the context of this material, there were no less traffic problems in Detroit than in New York. In a sense, there were even more of them, since all the cars that drove around the country left the Detroit factories at some point. Since in the conditional 20s, the vast majority of cars were produced in Detroit. And this city is so important for the automotive world that we even have a separate documentary about it. So, while the guys in New York were inventing rules, in Detroit they came up with something else. And, in order for us to understand the situation properly, we need to add a little context. But as usual, we can't do it without context. Traffic management at that time was handled by the police. It turned out that they did it quite conditionally, in fact. But it couldn't have been any other way in those conditions. At every important intersection, square, or any other road junction, traffic was organized manually. There was a traffic controller, and he showed with his hands who and where to go. And of course, the more cars there were, the more traffic controllers there were. But between us girls, they weren't much use. Firstly, it was difficult for drivers to see the guys, since the cars of that time were not transparent. And now, for example, it is normally visible through any car, since you have glass from all sides. The only exceptions are the angry butch fans of the workout, but we won't touch them yet. Let them sit in the twilight. At that time, if you look closely, the cars were not transparent, which means that you don't see a fig through the traffic at all. Not through the car in front of you, not through the car next to you. Secondly, not only is it not visible through the cars, but also in any busy place, Shasta, to the figures of pedestrians, who walked wherever they wanted, of course. And among the mess of people, to notice the inspectors, who does not stand out from the crowd in any way, is still a task. And while you're being stupid and can't understand, can you go, can't you go, where to go at all? What am I doing? Mom, help me. Drivers in the back are furious and honking, as they do not understand what is happening there at all, and do not know whether there is an inspector there or not. I can't see a fig. Thirdly, the traffic controllers themselves did not really add any order to the movement. They didn't know on which street how long the traffic jam is, which streets are freer, where to redirect traffic. It's not clear a fig. They just put you in the middle of the intersection and tell you to steer, and you're like, well, let's go now. Oh, and there's something the guys got excited. Well, then you wait. Let's go through for now. And so the whole day is absolutely at every important intersection in the city. Fourthly, estimate the police staff. which should provide every intersection in the city with a live inspector, and put several on difficult sites at once. Moreover, strictly speaking, this function did not rest against them at all, since the duties of the police did not actually include the regulation of traffic flows. They were simply given this task, since others are stupid not to foist. You can't force firemen to disperse cars. Plus, you need to understand that this whole staff of regulators needs to be trained. Dick understand what they were taught there, to be honest, since there were no rules. But if there is a position, then there should be an education. And they also need to be paid a salary. They need to be provided with equipment, uniforms, and so on. Plus, you can't just go to the police to recruit people from ads. We need a full cycle of personnel training for the law enforcement agency. There's a type of physical education, walking in formation, psychological training, a course on eating donuts, and so on. Fifthly, in addition to the fact that nothing is visible and not clear, do not forget that the inspector is a living person. It can get sick, it can blunt, it can overheat in the sun, get wet in the rain, freeze in the cold, and so on. In the end, someone will annoy him pretty well in the morning, with his own, everything is fine, with my mood, nothing has happened, and the whole intersection will stand all day and work inefficiently due to the fact that the person sleeping is all a bitch, fucked up. In short, it is not enough that the function was not performed normally, since a person is still not the most effective being, so there is also a personnel shortage. There are stupidly not enough hands for everything, and all this inefficient and cumbersome monster is also worth over a shitload of American US dollars. Such is the situation. But despite the fact that the guys just stood at intersections and manually tried to make the life of the city a little easier, one of the fundamental concepts in traffic appeared thanks to the Detroit police. More precisely, thanks to one traffic controller. The man's name was Harry Jackson. That's all we know about him. We couldn't even find a photo of him, but his name is mentioned in several scientific papers on urbanism in Detroit and on traffic management, so I'm inclined to believe that this man really existed. Harry was constantly adjusting the intersection of two streets, and on one of these streets, there was no normal view for the driver. Either there were some buildings there, or small buildings prevented drivers from seeing what was happening at the intersection, and, as Harry wrote in his report, he constantly had to slow down the flow from this street so that drivers could safely pass it. At some point in 1914, Harry thought that he was steaming. We need to put up some warning bullshit for drivers so that they can see in advance that they need to slow down a little. I must say that the signs as such already existed by that time, well, in some form. But, just from the fact that they existed in some form, read the dick understand in what form, they did not work normally. In fact, they were just wooden tablets on which, well, someone wrote something as he pleases. There was no regulation for any sign in nature. Do you know what else was square, rectangular, wooden or plywood, and hung on every corner at the same time? Advertising and signs, on which they wrote what anyone wanted. They hung on every house, on every corner, and at every shop, and in the center in general. Everything was always hung with various advertisements, and among such signs, it was simply unrealistic to recognize signs that were trying to inform the driver about something. They did not stand out in color nor in shape, and there was no practice for any identical signs to be hung in any country, in any important places. But it didn't stop our hero. Harry was a pretty smart and lazy character, with a good share of indifference. And this is the perfect mix for inventing new pieces. Without thinking twice, he took an ordinary square plate, sawed off the corners from it to get a unique octagonal shape. He wrote a hefty stop sign on this sign with a brush, and hung it at the intersection, from the side of the street, where he had to slow down traffic. And it worked. Drivers really began to slow down on their own, as they were straining that something would be dangerous here now, apparently. Just like that, no one will hang such an inscription here, so we need to make sure that everything is in order. Until a complete stop, few people slowed down, since there was no such practice and rules, but absolutely everyone began to slow down and look around. In fact, the dude just wanted to make his job a little easier, but without knowing it. He invented a fundamental principle in the organization of traffic, the rules of priority passage of intersections. As we remember, there were no legalized concepts of priority of travel and priority of travel at that time. Well, in addition to the priority rule for firefighters, there is an ambulance, police, post office in New York, although it must be remembered that these rules were conditional, since they were advisory in nature. And all over the country, you just have a road, some streets, cars, and that's it. Have fun as you want. But as soon as Harry stuck a stop sign at his intersection, not only did the drivers on the adjacent road become more careful, traffic went faster on the main road. But this effect, Harry did not expect at all. Drivers quickly realized that this section of the main road can now be driven faster, since traffic from the adjacent road will definitely slow down, and at least it can be safely bypassed. Or even you will be missed altogether. The fact that the intersection went faster was obvious from the observation log. Every inspector who regulated any section of the road had to fill out such a sign every day, according to which it was clear how long what place of the city was standing. And Harry also had such a magazine. Of course, as soon as Harry told the department about his observations and showed the results, the practice with the sign instantly spread throughout Detroit, since all the guards wanted to make their lives a little easier and unload the roads. In all difficult and critical areas, everything was hung with stop signs, purely at the discretion of the police officers who worked at this site, because people on Earth knew better than anyone what problems there were on their plots and where to hang them, and it worked. Not only were there fewer accidents at intersections, but drivers also felt more confident and drove faster. As soon as it became obvious to everyone that the priority sign was working, the police leadership and traffic engineers immediately pulled themselves up to this situation and began to form priority streets for driving. Somewhere it was quite obvious which street to stick the priority on. Somewhere they just put it at random. But all the main streets were very quickly equipped with such priority signs. And the idea of an octagonal shape in practice turned out to be just brilliant. Even without highlighting the color, the sign stood out well against the background of all the city garbage from different signs, and thus attracted the attention of drivers. But pretty quickly, the engineers came up with the idea to paint the signs yellow, as it seemed to them that such coloring best attracts the attention of drivers. And in 1922, the American Association of City Road Employees certified and standardized the stop sign. For all UF roads, it had the same octagonal shape, bright yellow color, and black stop sign. And in this form, the sign will last as long as 1954th year, and after that, it will turn red all over the world. In general, it is impossible to calculate, or even somehow estimate in theory, how many human lives were saved by such an uncomplicated invention of an ordinary traffic controller. To this day, the stop sign is the most important sign and foundation in safe, orderly traffic. This is the only sign that has an octagonal shape in the whole world. The signs Main Road and Give Way, which appeared much later, also have their own unique shape, just so that all three signs cannot be confused with other signs, since this is the basis of the basics. All other rules and restrictions do not have such force and influence on the traffic situation as priority signs. And thanks for that we have to say to the virtually nameless Detroit police inspector, about whom no one knows and no one remembers. If you go to Google and drive a stop sign there, then there will be information everywhere that it just appeared by itself. Somewhere it will be written that he appeared in the 15th year, somewhere in the 22nd, somewhere in the 17th, but everywhere there will be information that everything happened by itself. It's like that happens in the world when something appears just because. I myself did not know about this person, as I have already said, and found a mention in him in such hard-to-reach places where an ordinary person would definitely not climb. And in the real world, in fact, big things are very often done by small and inconspicuous and unknown people. And personally, on my own, I can only say thank you, Harry, to you for your ingenuity, because of the fact that he gave us the opportunity to drive confidently and calmly on the roads, knowing at what moment whom you should miss, in order to pass the intersection safely. priority signs, and the first editions of the traffic rules gave a direct noticeable result on the roads. In places where everything used to be hellish, traffic gradually accelerated. It is clear that the load on the transport system was still huge, but the roads really moved better. It was simply stupid to deny the effectiveness of these methods of regulating traffic flow. How do you think ordinary citizens perceive the innovation, which helped speed up traffic in all cities in the country? Due to the appearance of stop signs and traffic principles, it was now possible to get to the center. Less time to lose in infernal traffic jams, there were fewer minor accidents that could lock up traffic on the street, and so on. What was the reaction of society to all this movement? People were on strike against stop signs by all possible methods. This is not a joke. People tore down and destroyed the signs. Whole districts went on strike against the installation of signs, wrote angry letters to various authorities, to the police, and even sued. Not a joke. People, these are generally such guys. If someone is trying to do at least something useful, then you immediately need to come, shit everything, forbid, spit on the author, and in no case change our current life. And this is not only in Russia or in the States. It's the same everywhere. This is normal. It has always been, is, and will be. You just need to keep this in mind, especially if you're going to do something good. The main core of the dissatisfied were pedestrians who claimed that the new signs. This is a direct encroachment on their rights and freedoms. At this point, you may have a question in your head. What the fuck are the priority rules for cars and the rights with pedestrian freedoms? Yes, the question is logical. I was also fucked up at first when I unearthed the fact that people protested against priority signs. But that's what their logic was. Once again, we recall our already favorite picture, when you do not have any rules of priority travel at all. And we remove from this picture all traffic lights, all signs in general, all pedestrian crossings, and all traffic rules. Here you don't have a dick at all. Only roads, cars, and people who wander back and forth around the city. Oh, and put the horses and carts there too. They were still on the roads in noticeable numbers at that time. In such a picture, you as a driver will not go anywhere fast, no matter what you are driving. I wouldn't go anywhere at all, to be honest. But when no one is going anywhere fast, everyone is on the lookout and barely crawling, then it is very convenient for pedestrians to walk back and forth around the city, not paying attention to cars at all. At that time, when people were crossing the road, they didn't even look around. They were just walking along the road, across the road, diagonally, along the square, between the rows, as you like. Don't give a fuck at all. And everyone was happy with everything, especially pedestrians. Well, except for those pedestrians who were rolled out on the asphalt, but we'll get to them yet. Digging, fortunately, is shallow. When did priorities appear? When on some sections of the road, the drivers felt a little confident that no one would come to them in the barrel and block the road. They drove a little faster, and here the pedestrians tensed up. When a stream is rolling down the street at a speed of more than 5 kilometers per hour, you will not get under the wheels on a confident face. And since some streets were completely prioritized, streets with dense traffic and a relatively high average speed began to form. And how is it to cross when there are no pedestrian crossings? Nothing. Someone, of course, with the battle cry of a Japanese comic at the helm of the road, but there were few of them, and for obvious reasons, there were fewer and fewer every day. Plus, all traffic immediately came to the area where the signs were installed, since drivers are not fools either. If there is a street where you can drive with priority and without nerves, then everyone will go along it. And as a result, any street that the police or city engineers prioritized became simply impassable for pedestrians. You live in a quiet neighborhood, you go about your business back and forth, to a shop, there, to a bakery or to a bar, without really encountering car traffic. Then, without warnings and a declaration of war, they hang a bunch of signs all over your district, and after a couple of weeks, car traffic is figuring through your district, and it's simply unrealistic to cross roads, and how to buy buns, and how to drink in a bar. That's actually why the guys went on strike. The funniest thing was the courts, in which people filed lawsuits. In reality, people came to court and said, "These road baboons violate my rights and freedoms. I can't walk across the street to my mistress because of fast-moving cars. I immediately demand that all motorists piss and burn. I am ready to start pissing at the moment, and there seems to be nothing to answer to this. It seems to be yes, infringement on the face. And it seems that's what to do with this statement, ban cars. Usually the courts kept silent and let things down by all possible methods. But in Illinois in 1922, the guys still got their way, and the state court banned stop signs throughout the state. Yeah, for infringing on the rights and freedoms of pedestrians. True, the ban didn't last long, just a couple of years, but it's still a cool precedent. Clashes took place in the same way in the highest circles. Oddly enough, business protested against the rules of priority and priority streets. Here the logic was as follows. As soon as the people in charge of traffic heard that the priority road was going faster and unloading the neighboring streets, the guys began to try to divert traffic from the city center. In every big city, the most problematic place is the center. Firstly, the center is just a popular place in the city by itself. Secondly, cities used to be arranged in such a way that if you need to go from the south of the city to the north, for example, then you will need to drive through the center anyway. And just such guys passing by from the center always need to be cleaned up, since there is a lot there without them. Actually, city engineers, among others, solved this problem by setting priority on the streets that traveled around the center. Of course, some of the traffic from the center went to these bypass streets, and the business that was in the center was like this. These are our potential plea, where, believe me, get everyone back in the is. The business guys were immediately joined by all the owners of real estate in the center, since the fewer people in the center, and the fewer people go to it, the cheaper real estate is there. And these are expenses, and this is not no, we don't need it here. Let everyone die in traffic jams, but we won't tolerate losses. And if you consider that the owners of real estate in the center are usually very influential guys, their resistance greatly hindered the diversion of traffic from the center. The toughest fight against the urban elites was in Boston. There, the guys wanted to make a whole expressway that would divert traffic from the center, but the top fiercely defended the usual state of affairs. They justified it all by saying that the road is expensive, whatever it is at all, it only needs to be made worse, and so on. And even a whole scientific work has been written on these collisions, which is called the battle for the street. It's a terrible nuisance actually, but for geeks like me, it's very interesting. There was no simple solution. Whenever the interest of a large number of people is touched upon in some issue, the situation will not resolve quickly and easily, and around each new road or some priority street, heated disputes flared up, which could last for years. But still, the advantage of orderly movement was obvious, and the question moved slowly and gradually. With the help of priority signs, so-called high-speed highways were formed in every major city, along which all the main traffic moved, along with trams and other public transport. Pedestrians, of course, were sad about it. Sometimes it's even deadly sad. But what can I do? To bury, what else to do? But we are not very interested in a very brave and courageous food for earthworms at the moment. And here's what's important to us. The stop sign, which fixed the rules of priority travel, was quite a working thing, but it could not help in all situations. When you have the main and adjacent roads, the sign worked perfectly. There are no questions. But what to do when several roads come to one place at once, to some square, for example, or you have an intersection of two equally busy streets? And at such points, the stop signs stupidly did not work. More precisely, if you just hang a stop sign on one of these roads, then you will create a terrible traffic jam on this street, which will resolve only at night when cars run out on the main street. In such a situation, when it is necessary that two or more roads move without interference, at the same time safely, and with the same priority, we do not rest on who is the main and who is secondary, but on the question of who is going in what order. And this was the next big task, on which it was necessary to find a solution very quickly. Who goes in what order? This is an eternal question not only of roads, but also in principle of any movement. Even about who first passes through the door or enters the room, people argue their entire history. Once a man was the first to enter the room, then the rituals were changed, and it became correct to open the door to a lady in a gentlemanly way, and to go in after yourself. Now, in modern times, as we see with you, if you are eager to open the door, then you are not a gentleman, but a sexist who considers girls weak creatures who are unable to open the door for themselves. In this regard, the world can have fun as you like, but I personally will open doors to all girls and grannies until a very old age, no matter how they call me for it. That's the kind of person I am. But on the roads, as a rule, the authorities always went first. The carriage of especially wealthy citizens, government officials there, well, and these are all the guys. Who is higher in the hierarchy, he passes. If, relatively speaking, in tourist times, some serf on a crooked horse would climb ahead of the carriage of some honorable citizen at the intersection, then this gentleman's ass would burn very nobly, and then the ass would burn at the serf. From a billion growth and beatings. Such is the cycle of burnt bugs in society. But when there were too many cars, the hierarchy of ranks no longer worked. I'm sorry, I can't see your rank through the car, and not before that at all. We need to unload the intersection, let the cars arrive, and so on. In short, etiquette does not solve the problem, no matter how gallant you are. In the 1900th years, the question of who goes in what order, in fact, was answered by all the same regulators. They manually, at their discretion, slowed down one street, gave the right of way to another street, waited for some sufficient time, in their opinion, and gave the cue to other cars, as we already know. And we also know that the traffic controller, this thing is ineffective, if we are talking about all intersections and squares in the country. Therefore, in parallel with the whole movement of stop signs, traffic jams, and public outrage about, a system was developed that would be responsible for the order of passage of intersections. At that time, for the conditional 1910th years there, the most effective system responsible for the order of travel was the semaphore system on the railways. And it worked perfectly, clearly, and almost without failures. What is a semaphore at that time, in a nutshell? This is such a hefty pole that stands along the tracks, with two wings that signal to the driver whether it is possible to go, or it is necessary to stand. Taking into account the risks of non-compliance with the semaphore signal on the railway, this is a very strict rule. If one of the drivers violates the semaphore sign, then at best just a couple of trains will derail, and at worst, a huge mess of wagons and human bodies is provided for you, and also damage to the tracks, blocking the road for a long period due to repairs and huge losses. Therefore, the semaphore signal was calculated in no way. Stop, please, and how to stand fucking still and not twitch. And such a system worked very well on the railways and ensured the correct order of travel. When the risks and responsibilities are very high, people obey the rules very well. Therefore, when there was a question with the organization of the order of travel on highways, at first they tried to integrate semaphores into them. The first versions appeared in Britain, France, and the States, of course. But the efficiency was zero. The drivers just didn't listen. They either didn't notice them in the total mass of signs, lanterns, and other shit, or just hammered the bolt. Because I can see where I'm going. There's no one there. No one there. So why am I going to stand here when I can drive through? And when someone was caught by inspectors for non-compliance, then still, oh, sorry, I didn't notice, sorry. And I must say that such semaphores were really hard to see, especially in the evenings or in the rain with fog. People didn't always pay attention to the traffic controllers, but there's some kind of pole with signs that are fucking simple. What to do with it? I'm not a trained driver, I don't know. There were a huge number of variations of semaphores. All over the world, various forms and types of poles were invented here and there, indicating the order of passage, but it had no real effect. In the States, the use of semaphores on public roads has been fought there for about 22 years. The first one appeared in 1908, and the last ones were removed in 1930, since they were of no use, as there was no sense from the traffic controllers in the booths, which were also experimented on. Someone thought that since no one can see the traffic controller, since he is standing in the crowd, and does not stand out from the crowd in any way, let's put a booth that will be above all people, the flow of cars. Put a person there, and let him conduct the whole orchestra from it. The first such booth appeared in 1915, and they ended their existence in 1930, together with semaphores. At some point, with the invention of the incandescent lamp and the advent of electricity in cities, humanity in a certain mass gets to the point of replacing the semaphore with the same crap, only with light bulbs. The very first traffic light in the States appeared in Cleveland in 1914 at the intersection of 105th Street and Esclida Avenue, which put the local police department apartment there, of course. It was a simple box with two light bulbs, one green, the other red. And of course, this traffic light included an employee who still manually stopped the flow and allowed another to go. But now he was doing it under traffic lights. And this person also switched signals in manual mode. It was necessary not so much because there was no automatic switching mechanism, but simply because as soon as the inspector left, everyone together hammered the bolt into the traffic light and drove as they wanted. But all the same, even though you have a person physically pulling the switch and then waving his hands to explain the traffic light signal, the traffic light turned out to be useful, so it was clearly visible to drivers. At last they could see something. And 3 years later, the Detroit Police Department came up with the idea to add a yellow signal to it, so that the passing stream of cars had time to clear the intersection. But, despite the fact that traffic lights already existed in some form, this man is considered to be the father of all traffic lights on the planet. Garrett Morgan, one of the outstanding inventors of America. He is outstanding primarily because he was a Negro. How hard it is for me to notice. Fuck myself. Yes, of course, this is an achievement. Yes, I could do that too. Some of you may think, and if I tell you that he is the first black famous inventor of America, it's also not surprising. You'd think I'm the first Negro who learned to write and read. You can object to me, but no, the situation is a little more interesting here. I'll explain now. Garrett was born into the family of a former slave, Sidney Morgan, in 1877. It seems to have been recently, just 150 years ago. But then, if you were born with the wrong skin color, then you could only count on a kind and supportive host. If you were considered an object slightly more significant than the entrance mat at the door, then this is already a success, and a lot of luck. Officially, slavery in the United States was abolished in 1865, 2 months after the end of the American Civil War. Everyone amicably signed pieces of paper that Negroes are now people too, and dispersed satisfied. But it's not for me to explain to you that the signed pieces of paper, this is one thing, but real life, this is a little different. The foundations and ideas of people, what is right and what is not, do not change at the click of a finger. Therefore, in fact, although slavery was abolished, the life of the black population has not changed dramatically. At least, the attitude towards them was exactly the same as before. Only to the general opinion that a black person is something at the level of an animal. There was also a general outrage at the fact that now their opinion will also have to be taken into account, and generally taken into account. And naturally, the black population lived separately, their communes, and no one really considered their rights. Even if someone killed a Negro somewhere, they successfully turned a blind eye to it. One less, one more, who cares, they will sit down, they are still not visible. It was in such an atmosphere and society that a small town was born and grew up. Since he was from the family of a former slave, he did not have to count on at least some successful starting position in life. Survived and is already well. Not all of his 11 brothers and sisters coped with this task, by the way. With just a few grades of schooling, he moves to Cleveland in search of his path. But the only job he could find was working in the fields for a landowner. Since he is still a Negro, we do not forget. Yes, a free man. Yes, already a man. But the beds will not weed themselves. For several years, he had to work on plantations, but despite the fact that they paid him something for free there, he somehow managed to pay for a tutor who simply gave him a normal basic education. And after Garrett sorted out the school curriculum, he hit physics and all sorts of engineering stuff because he really liked it. I can't say that his landowner liked it very much, but Garrett didn't ask him much. A free person, after all, do not forget. At some point, Garrett becomes interested in sewing machines. Not by the fact that sewing machines, but by the fact that a lot of people then sewed clothes for themselves. Especially the black population, since there was not much money for clothes. And since there were a lot of cars, they were all cheap and of a crooked design. Frankly, they also broke down very often. And Garrett decided that he could solve this issue. Plus, he came up with several improvements for sewing machines, patented them, and opened his workshop, where he repaired and improved the machines. Their case is more reliable. What was the essence of his patents is not important to us. It is important that his business began to gain momentum, which is why Garrett was able to calmly leave his plantation to do his own business, which he opened, by the way, together with his wife. It was somewhere around 1907th year. History is silent about the exact date. At some point, when the workshop already existed, Garrett was puzzled by the problem of wool, not his own, but a material for clothes. The problem was that the machines very often singed it, because the needle moved too fast, and the hairs stupidly began to smolder. And Garrett thought that he could try to come up with some composition that could be applied to wool or to a needle to reduce friction, and to calmly sew clothes from wool. He locked himself in his room. Where is he there? I locked myself in and started experimenting. He couldn't do anything sensible, but in one of the experiments, he got some kind of slurry that straightened the wool fibers very well. You put it on a piece of wool, and literally in 15 minutes, the curly wool fibers turn into perfectly smooth. Garrett decided that it was necessary to try this shit on something else, as it became very interesting. At first, he was afraid to try it on himself, but the neighbor's dog was ideally suited for the first test subject. After all, at that time, dogs already stood slightly lower in supination than Negroes, so everything was fair. Garrett smeared pestle with goo and went about his business. Returning after some time, I made sure that the dog with straight hair, happy, wagging his tail, so the slurry turned out to be safe. And since pestle is not bald from such jokes, then everything will be fine with me, Garrett thought, and began testing the composition on himself. Something tells me, well, purely from the point of view of male curiosity, that Garrett straightened all the hair he could find on himself. But in all official materials, biographies and so on, it says that he straightened his hair only on his head. Yes, I believe it willingly. Maybe one of you is like, wait a minute, what the fuck are you doing here? What the fuck is a hair straightener? We're talking about traffic. Oh, crowbars, how did you end up here in the first place? I understand your worries, but I'm a professional, trust me. This is important to us, because Garrett patented this liquid and began selling it to blacks in unrealistic volumes. The girls bought this remedy in a crowd, since we know the standard problem of girls, that if you have straight hair, then they must be curled. If you have curly hair, then you definitely need to straighten it, and that's what black women have hair. That's the perfect business model for you. The cream was so successful that Garrett was able to make a fortune on it by the standards of that time, and adjusted for the fact that he was a Negro, and Garrett became the first black citizen in Cleveland who could afford a private car. That's why I'm telling you all this. Well, the story with the hibernation is cool. When Garrett got behind the wheel of his car and started driving around the city, he just fucked up. Not from the fact that he was able to buy a car, but from how much he was pressed on the road. And you and I remember that the papers were signed, Negroes are no longer slaves, they are also people. But papers can very rarely have an impact on real relationships. And okay, when ordinary drivers cut off and did not let Garrett pass, a separate fire of his ass with straight hair happened to him at every intersection, which was regulated by a policeman. When the traffic controller saw a Negro driving up to the intersection, he was like, oh, that's it. This street is standing until tomorrow. All the rest, guys, we drive like a buzz. And it was terribly infuriating. You've come out of the bottom. There can't be a slave below the family. You've worked and studied a lot. Thanks to your head and your work, you did something useful for people to make their lives better, for which they repaid you with money. And then ordinary people don't put you on the road to fuck just because you're a different color. And of course, it wasn't just on the road. A few years after Garrett came up with his hair straightening cream, he comes up with the idea of how to make a special mask that can help firefighters stay longer in a burning building. It looked like a mask with a hood, from which a long hose with a special sponge filter at the end came out. And this hose was essentially lying on the floor, where the smoke is always lower than at the top, and it was possible to breathe through it calmly. Garrett called his invention a safety hood, and you and I already know that this thing is called a gas mask. And Garrett invented and patented it the very first in the world. The effectiveness of the invention was very evident. Garrett had a tent, lit a fire in it, waited for a lot of smoke to accumulate there, climbed inside, and could sit there for half an hour without experiencing any problems at all. But the firefighters and the military who benefited from this invention could not even admit the thought that they would walk in a mask, which was invented by a native of a family of slaves. They would rather suffocate indoors with an open face and a round chest than put this on themselves. Garrett had to hire a white actor for the presentation, who posed as the author of the invention, and Garrett himself performed under an experienced monkey, which was stuffed into the smoke to show the effectiveness of the invention. And from this angle, everyone normally perceived the effectiveness of the invention and agreed that yes, Oklahoma, it can now be used. And this attitude towards black people was only 100 years ago. In 1916, when drilling a tunnel in Cleveland, there was an explosion of natural gas which collapsed the panel, and all the workers were under the rubble. At the same time, in the remains of the tunnel, everything was so heavily in the dust from the concrete that rescuers could enter to help people. Garrett and his brother, wearing their hoods, climbed into the rubble and were able to save 2 people, as well as pull 4 dead from the rubble. After this tragedy, it became obvious to everyone that Garrett's gas mask is really a working thing, and the fire department, along with the army, began to buy from Garrett's company. At the same time, for his invention and heroic act in the collapse of the tunnel, he was nominated for an award, but he did not become a laureate because of the color of his skin. We do not forget. It is unrealistic to calculate how many human lives were saved by the gas mask that Garrett invented, but this contribution in no way affected the life of this man, since he remained a Negro for ordinary people anyway. Consider yourself a second-rate person. Garrett spoke publicly a lot, pointed out problems in society, but he found support only among the black population. White people, despite all his merits, did not put Garrett in anything, especially on the road. History is silent on whether Garrett took the idea of a traffic light that already existed at that time or came up with his own, without spying on anyone. But he became the first inventor who invented his own traffic light design in 1917 and patented it in 22, which looked like this. And most importantly, he decided that he would ensure that traffic was regulated by a traffic light at every important intersection, and not by a person. As Garrett himself wrote, the traffic light does not care about your skin color, the cost of your car, and your social status. Traffic light, this is the only mechanism that makes all drivers absolutely equal on the roads. And this is exactly the state of affairs that we should strive for. And they heard him. Firstly, not only Negroes were infringed on the roads. At that time, only a few blacks in the whole country had their own cars, but they very often worked as drivers for white people and were pinched at every opportunity. Secondly, truck drivers were also constantly not allowed at intersections and clamped in the flow. Thirdly, from our documentary Promisel Car, we remember that the 20s, this is prohibition, mafia, reckless drivers with machine guns on the roads, and the traffic light really doesn't care about your social status, your vending machine in the trunk, and your skin color. Everyone is either standing or driving the same way. And thanks to Garrett's perseverance, his constant public appearances, cooperation with automobile clubs, and a sincere desire to remove injustice from public roads, society very vigorously welcomed each new traffic light. Cleveland road engineers conducted studies that showed that 98% of drivers listened to traffic lights, while only 41% of drivers listened to a stop sign. And public support, research on traffic signals allowed the police to install automatic traffic lights, which did not need to introduce an inspector to monitor the execution. Plus, taxi companies, bus fleets, delivery services, and other guys who were interested in good traffic management began to allocate their own money for the installation of traffic lights on key routes for them. Firstly, it was beneficial to them when traffic moves faster. Secondly, it was a very good move when the company publicly supported equality and respect on the road. Plus, the police were finally able to reduce the number of traffic controllers. For example, the New York Police Department in 1930 counted that the introduction of traffic lights helped to reduce the staff of traffic controllers from 6,000 people to 500. And this saving of about $12.5 million is purely on salaries. And for the 1930th year, this is just a huge amount. Thus, in fact, due to a terrible sense of injustice towards himself and an irrepressible desire to change this state of affairs, Garrett Morgan became a prominent public figure and the world-famous inventor of the traffic light. The fact that it was he who invented it is a controversial fact, of course, since traffic lights already existed before Garth. But without the labors of this man, they would not have become so popular on the roads overnight. Yes, someday slowly, the whole country would still be hung with traffic lights. But thanks to Morgan, it happened lightning fast by the standards of history. And the more traffic lights there were, and the faster they were installed, the more people could safely get to their homes. In fact, by the 1930s, the fundamental postulates of the organization of traffic were formed. The first rules, the concept of the priority of the passage of intersections, and the concept of the order of passage of these intersections. So far, these three things. This is the foundation on which our entire movement stands. In addition, along the line of our narrative, we are about in the 20s, 30s, in the heyday of the automotive industry as such. There are more and more cars, cities, and people already roughly understand how to live with it. And in some parts of the world, traffic is beginning to acquire at least some kind of orderly appearance. But all the way, we have not noticed one important fact. More precisely, one very important statistic. That's what a car is for you and me. This is practically an animated friend or family member, as a rule, a piece that gives us a sense of freedom, emotions from driving, and enhances the taste of this life. Yes, that's right. But it's all joyful, fun, exactly until the car kills someone. Traffic jams and cars buzzing in them. This, of course, is a problem, but in fact, it all paled against the background of the real shit that was happening on the roads. We recall once again our favorite picture, when there are no rules, priorities, and add to it that you can go at any speed. You can go drunk, you can go if you are blind in one eye, and you will also go for two eyes, listening only more closely. Have you never been behind the wheel of a car and have no idea how to drive it? Welcome to the public road. Here are those glasses of whiskey for courage. And go ahead, great-grandmothers, Hallel. That's the principle that the roads of that time lived by. Yes, the first tests of rights and exams, obsessions existed, but they all consisted in the fact that if you can just move off and turn the steering wheel to the right and left, then that's it, well done. And we also remember that before the road was perceived not as something for cars, and it is dangerous to go out, but as a common area where you can walk anywhere and anywhere. Children were not taught in schools that they should be careful and not play on the roads. People didn't look left and right when crossing, and so on. And, as it is not difficult to guess, with this state of affairs, the winding of people on cars occurred very often, terrifyingly often. Here's another chart of car sales volume for you. And here's a graph of deaths on public roads. The statistics were monstrous, especially because 3/4 of all these victims were pedestrians, and the largest part of them, 60%, were children. If any figure in the traffic statistics is capable of causing horror, then this is it. The concept of playgrounds did not exist, so the children calmly played right on the road. They ran between cars, played ball between passing cars, played hide-and-seek, hiding behind the bumpers of cars. If you open the press of the 1920s, then almost everyday articles were published about how someone somewhere crashed to death, or played bowling with pedestrians. Detroit Free, Press of the 22nd of June, 1919. The car hit a group of 5 children, aged from 2 to 9 years. The driver got out of the car for a minute after the collision, then jumped back into it, started it up, and drove east along Monroe Street, leaving the injured children on the road. The drivers did not find it. The same newspaper in the same year wrote about how an 18-year-old boy was hit by a car that was moving at high speed. And when his father and the police were able to get the mutilated body out of the car suspension, the distraught mother went home and hanged herself. The same Detroit Press of June 29, 1914. On Sunday evening, a car carrying a couple of newlyweds, as well as several wedding guests and 3 children, overturned, turning at a speed of about 40 miles per hour, Week Avenue on Woodward, and no survivors are reported. And judging by the number of bottles of liquor that were in this car, there were no sober people there. In one of the police reports of approximately the same time period, there is information about the detention of a young woman who drove along the sidewalk and killed several people at once. The problem here is that, firstly, it was her 26th arrest for reckless driving. Secondly, she had a doctor's certificate that she suffers from memory lapses and periodically loses consciousness, and this was happening all over the country. Not just in Detroit, of course. For example, I had a separate chill on my back, caused by articles describing cases when children were hit by cars with the same children at the wheel. There was no minimum age to get behind the wheel then either, if anything. And a very large number of teenagers from poor families, as soon as they could reach the pedals, got a job as drivers in various companies for the delivery of goods. There is a type of production, or in some farm, and so on. Be well aware. Children were hit to death by children at the wheel. I don't even want to joke in this place, but you still have to. Otherwise, you'll get really sad there. Do you know how a cyclist differs from a motorcyclist? The size of the dents on the hood. To add to our whole picture, we also add that one of the most dangerous places for people was the tram. No matter how strange it might seem, tram rails, as they are today, mostly ran in the middle of the roadway, but there were no rules that passengers who get out of it should perform, as well as there were no stop signals for trams and markings that could somehow warn the driver that now people will climb under the wheels from the tram to him. Therefore, everyone who got off the tram was immediately shot down, and new people who were lucky enough to dodge cars were loaded on the tram, and it all started on you. In short, that's what I'm talking about. If one of us who has already grown up in the existing traffic management system were placed at that time and in that order, it would be a shock. It wasn't long, though, because you would have been shot down instantly, but we would have had some time to catch a huevos. All the newspapers were full of headlines that the car is a ruthless killer with whom something urgently needs to be done. There were constant discussions in state bodies and public platforms about who was to blame, what to do. And hundreds of people died on the roads every day. To the question who is to blame, they answered very simply, the driver is always to blame, without discussions and options. If a driver who got into a fatal accident managed to survive himself and the police managed to catch him, then he went to prison. Practically without trial and investigation. The fatal outcome in an accident was simply equated with murder, and the culprits were quietly sent to jail. But not all instances agreed with this point of view. The Georgia Court of Appeals, for example, wrote that cars should be classified as ferocious animals, and the law concerning the duties of owners of such animals should apply to their owners. According to this law, the term was given a little less, but still the situation was so-so. That's what I mean. The first thing the authorities came up with. This is to limit the speed to the minimum possible. And what was the logic here? Previously, all transport was horse-drawn. People didn't die in such packs, and when cars appeared, he began to die. And this is all due to the fact that cars can accelerate faster, so let's limit the speed to 5 miles per hour, to the speed of a cart with a horse, and everything will be fine. The initiative was immediately supported, and instructions immediately flew all over Detroit to find and catch all drivers who go faster than 5 miles per hour. The fact that the drivers were not aware that it was impossible to go faster, since no one talked about it, was not taken into account, as well as the fact that it is impossible to measure the speed, especially from the outside, by eye, was not taken into account, as well as the fact that there were no fucking speedometers in cars was not taken into account. But all the same, such orders were enough to start catching drivers who go faster than the flow, and somehow try to punish them. Someone got off with just a warning or a strict conversation there, someone was fined. But the traffic situation required a more serious approach than just catching some piece number of motorists. And one person understood it very well. Meet James J. Cousins. Another horseradish is asking what name is in our material. James was born in the town of Chatham in Canada, in the family of an ordinary soap maker. The soap maker crafts soap, and Dick knows how to do it right. His father and mother cooked soap together, although the parents earned a little, but they were very clean. By some miracle, they were able to pay for their son to study at a local business college. And having graduated and successfully completed his studies, James leaves for Detroit. And since he had no connections there, no relatives, no one, he got a job on the railway as an ordinary mechanic, where he would then work for 7 years. Since he was a smart guy, he was naturally promoted, and at the end of his work in Detroit, he was responsible for the technical condition of special-purpose trains. It included not only government trains, but also trains for wealthy citizens, businessmen and industrialists. In this position, he is noticed by a certain Alexander Young Malcolmson, a man who constantly traveled on such trains for the powerful. For my heart, the two words Yant and Malcolm standing together occupy a separate place, since Malcolm is young. This is the rhythm guitarist and CDC, who died just a few years ago. Although this is not exactly the right place, but thank you, Malcolm, for the multiple musical orgasm in my head. It is unlikely that I will be able to make a more public gratitude to CDC in my life, so keep it in this material under the heading, The Most Inappropriate Declaration of Love for the Guitarist. Alexander Young Malcolmson, of course, had nothing to do with rock roll, but he had quite an understandable, direct relationship with the railways. He was a coal magnate, and when he noticed a promising guy, he immediately took him to his personal assistance. In 1897, they will have a very cool tandem in a business that will work for many years. By the time that we are interested in, namely 1919, James Couzens is already a dollar millionaire and quite an influential person in Detroit. And in parallel with business, he also conducted public work. From 1913 to the 15th, he held the position of Commissioner for Street Railways Detroit and was engaged in the prevention of accidents and deaths on the tramways of the city. And from the 16th to the 19th, he held the position of commissioner in the Detroit Metro, in fact, dealing with the same security, but in the subway. And oddly enough, James was a consistent critic of the position taken by the public and the courts, that the driver is always to blame for everything. That's what I'm telling you about him. From his experience working on the railways, when he worked as a simple mechanic, James knew that how you don't regulate the industry, how hard you don't scare, and without controlling the drivers, follow the rules. If some kamikaze pedestrian climbs on the rails of the previous train out of his stupidity, then he is guaranteed to be smeared very colorfully on the same rails. And even later like that, and the driver, even though he was traveling, observing all the rules and precautions, will still kill a person, since he simply physically will not be able to stop the train. So James shouted at the top of his voice that it wasn't just the drivers who were to blame. At a minimum, this is a mutual responsibility, and in some cases, the fault lies entirely with the pedestrian. Society, in response to such a hitandron, said that James, the defender of bloodthirsty murderers, that he justifies the violence of the upper circles, who have cars over the bottoms, who do not have them. When James began his public work on the city's railways, he was convinced every day that he was right. He personally went to the places of fatal accidents, not only on the railway, but also on ordinary roads, and tried to understand the causes of what happened. And very often, he saw that the driver just physically could not do anything, when people just naturally threw themselves under the wheels, without realizing what they were doing. Everyone got used to it 20 years ago, that you walk around the city as you please, and as if you didn't notice, that the appearance of the city has changed a little since that time. James constantly wrote reports and public reports, gave examples that pedestrians very often create game, and naturally kill themselves on the roads. And the driver then has to serve a prison sentence. In fact, James publicly defended this position alone, since no one has ever considered the circumstances of the accident in the courts. Pedestrians who participated in the accident were never asked about anything, as they can hardly be heard from the coffin. Although James, in fact, was alone, he had a very great political weight in this matter, since by the time of 1919, he had already been engaged in railway safety in the city for 6 years. And they slowly began to listen to his opinion. And they began to listen to him especially attentively when, in the same 1919, he became mayor of Detroit. At this point, it would probably be necessary to explain a little why. Like an ordinary person, he had serious respect and influence in the industrial capital of the world. Here's the thing. Remember, I said that a certain Alexander Young Malcolmson took him to his assistant, and they turned out to be a cool tandem. So, the The guys found each other in 1897th year, and in 1902, 5 years after they worked together at the Malcolmson Coal Company, Alexander comes to James and is like, listen, there's a promising guy here who made one funny thing on wheels. In short, there is a chance to invest in the boys and help him with the organization of production. You can pour in a relatively small amount of money, give him our capacities, and then suddenly something will come out of it. What do you think about? James, of course, happily agreed. He borrowed money, and together with Malcolmson's money, they decided to embark on an adventure and open a company for three. Alexander Malcolmson became the main shareholder as he poured in the largest amount of money, as much as $3,000 to be exact. James became the secretary of the meeting of directors and the holder of a smaller package, as he threw off only $2,500, and the boy was responsible for production. The boy was named, by the way, Henry Ford, and they all founded the Ford Motor Company together. Malcolmson will award in the company not so long. He'll be out of Ford in 1906, 2 years before the appearance of Ford Model 10, because he believed that the future of the car market was behind expensive and premium cars. He was constantly arguing with the guys about what to do with Fat, Luhari and all that. And Ford and Cousins insisted that they needed a car for the masses. In the end, Malcolmson spat, sold his share for $175,000 in uniform, and took off into the sunset. But James Cousins stayed in the company longer and led it with Ford until 1919. And when he wanted to go out to engage in political activity, he would sell his share, which once cost $2,500, to the same Ford a little more expensive, for $30 million. With such a background, it becomes a little clearer why this person became the mayor of an industrial city. Not because he bought the position, but because he could bring it out, given that he had been running an industrial monster for 17 years. And it becomes a little more clear his motivation to protect the rights of drivers, since they were his clients. Plus, all the speed limits and public oppression had a bad effect on sales. And quite often, James is credited with a purely commercial interest in his public activities. They say he needed to sell cars, so he defended the drivers. But by the time he took office as mayor, he no longer had a financial relationship with Ford, and was the owner of a huge fortune at that time. Therefore, I personally have very little faith in this theory. But one way or another, James was elected to the mayor's chair, under the auspices that he would make the roads of Detroit safe, since this was a very painful issue in the society of that time. In fact, the cousin brought the work in two directions. The first, this is a restriction on the freedom of movement of pedestrians on the roadway. The second is to educate the public that it is necessary to be more careful somehow, and look where you are going. What was meant by the phrase restrictions and freedoms terrible for liberals? The cousin demanded that pedestrians could cross the road only in a certain place, and only at right angles. There should be no walking along the road and diagonally. Only at right angles and only before the intersection. It was also forbidden to go to the intersection itself. As soon as the decree was issued, James immediately received such a tsunami of shit in his direction that how dare he restrict the holy rights of citizens to freely fucking walk the streets, and the holy rights to suicide under the wheels of a cursed car. The press, public figures, and other particularly intelligent citizens foamed at the mouth to prove that the cousin, a fucking devil and a dictator. But fortunately, the mayor of the city did not care about the whole thing. Firm a high bell tower. Anyone who has held high leadership positions for a long time is not used to the fact that you are always to blame for all the troubles, and generally a piece of shit, no matter what you do. Any manager knows that as soon as you try to change the established order of affairs, even if you do it for the good, in response you will get a bunch of shit and spit in the back. And it works the same way, both in production and in the social structure, wherever it is. Moreover, when they get used to your innovations, and they show their effectiveness, no one will thank you. Everyone will think that it happened by itself. That's how it happened. Miracles. Therefore, James did not pay any attention to the cries of the public. He just did as he saw fit, and then looked at the numbers. The second direction, as I have already said, was to educate people about. And James was the initiator of the creation of security parades, which were held every year across the country. Initially, they appeared in Detroit, but after the first parade, other megacities adopted the practice. The parade performed two important functions. Firstly, it was an event where the public could vent their grief and emotions about relatives and loved ones who died on the roads. People came with photos and names, lit candles, sang prayers, and showed their love and sorrow for the victims in every possible way. Secondly, performances with actors were mandatory at parades, in which the carelessness of pedestrians was ridiculed. James thought that for a normal discussion of the problem, it is necessary to reduce the sacredness of the victims and destroy this holy image of a pedestrian who selflessly climbs under the wheels. The idea was brilliant. Actors in clown outfits were walking down the street. A car drove up to them, pushed them slightly, and they had a lot of fun arguing with him. And in this way, the image of the hapless pedestrian was securely fastened to the image of the clown. And it worked great. Instead of putting a policeman at the intersection every time, who would run after all pedestrians with a stick, James made it so that society itself began to ridicule people who crossed the road at random. Like, look, at least Padre, just like a clown. And the sacred sacrifice under the wheels, for a couple of years of showing such miniatures, kamikaze pedestrians turned into clowns. Brilliant. After all, there is nothing more effective on an ordinary citizen than public censure. When you are a holy sacrifice, you will climb under the wheels with a full chest and straightened shoulders in a righteous impulse. And when they point a finger at you in exactly the same situation and say that you are a clown, you won't even have such a thought. On the contrary, you will be afraid to cross the road somehow wrong, so as not to attract such attention to yourself in any case. And all this led to the fact that a special term appeared among the people, which was called such pedestrians. Jaywalker. J-slang of the time. This is a country bumpkin who came to the city from some kind of squalor and does not know how to behave in the city and in a civilized society. And it was a straight swear word. It's a shame. And the word Jaywalker meant just such a redneck who walks around the city as if on a field from his village. And now in the modern world, the term Jay-Vulcan still exists. It's just that now he assigns the crossing of the street not according to the rules. That's when a person crosses a 10-lane avenue, not through a pedestrian crossing, and at the same time still stands on a double solid. He's Jay-Vulker, not a fucker, as we used to think, but Jay-Vulker. Do not confuse. In the 3 years that James Couzens has been running Detroit, he has made it the safest of all megacities in the United States. In terms of road deaths, there was still a lot of work to be done, but the pace at which Detroit was moving in terms of security surprised the whole country. In just a couple of years, from a demon who was criticized by the whole city, James turned into a pet who was appreciated and respected. And I can only add for myself that James Couzens is a brilliant manager and man from whom we should all learn. Only a genius can turn a very sensitive issue in society upside down so abruptly and really improve the situation. Another genius, about whom very few people know. The harsh irony was that despite the fact that we use the rules and principles of the road every day, when we go out on public roads or just walk around the city, no one remembers the names of the people who stood at the origins. The creator of the stop sign, Harry Jackson, you will not find anywhere at all. William Phelpson, the creator of the first rules of the road, is known only by very narrow specialists. And in William's obituary, which appeared in the New York Times in the 45th year, there is not even a photograph of him. Some aunt who owned a funeral home has a picture, but Phelps doesn't. Garrett Morgan is remembered, yes. Bill Clinton even once pushed a wreath in his honor, but they remember him only because the racial issue is very sensitive in the States. And Garrett is one of the heroes of all people who care about the racial issue, since he was able to break into people no matter what. But if he had been a white man, it is not a fact that his name would have remained at least known to anyone, even despite his merits. For myself, I can only send a virtual thank you from the SAFE movement itself. Even though they will never get it. William Phelps Ina died in the 45th, a few months after the end of the war. Garrett Morgan died in 63, and nothing is known about Harry Jackson at all. James Couzens will be elected to the Senate after the end of his term in the mayor's chair, in which he will continue to work on road safety, but on a nationwide scale. And also, as a senator, he will establish a children's charity fund of the state of Michigan and raise $10 million to help children. At the same time, at the opening of the fund, he will donate $1 million from his personal money to it. And, until the very last days of his life, in 1936, James will work to make the roads of his country as safe as possible. In the 2012 year, James Couzens, the only one of all the heroes of this material, will be included in the Automotive Hall of Fame for his services, the formation of the Ford Company, as well as a man who worked until the end of his days in order to save millions of pedestrian lives across the country. The principles that James believed in, as you and I can see, still live and work all over the world. You and I, as pedestrians, have been learning since childhood that it is necessary to cross the road only in specially designated places and only at right angles. Our whole world, for the most part, rests on structures that are built by such inconspicuous people as the heroes of this material. I call them inconspicuous because 95% of you, or even more, have heard these names and surnames for the first time in your life today, even though we use their life's work every day. And we think at the same time that this is a kind of self-evident thing. That's all I can say about it. Basic principles of traffic management. This is not just because it happened, but because they were invented by people for people. And it would be very cool if these people were remembered. Especially attentive viewers of our documentaries, especially those who remember the material well. For 75 minutes you will be strapped in, can now be like a Krashenidze. Wait, what are you singing odes to some dudes here? They say they made everything safe, tralala. Open the statistics of deaths on U.S. roads, which you showed us yourself, and look at her carefully. It was growing at a wild pace, and yes, you are right if you had such an idea. Hold a kiss for attentiveness. But you will also get a kick in the ass, since you cannot look at the statistics of road deaths simply as a figure. And here let's slow down for a while, and you'll understand what I mean. Here, we see a graph of deaths on U.S. roads in the first half of the 20th century. And yes, such a sight, especially by the standards of the states, since around the middle of the century, they lost more citizens on the roads than in the world wars. The absolute mortality was monstrous. At the same time, it grew from year to year and greatly worried the public. Everyone continued to discuss the terrible situation on the roads, but in the same way, with great pleasure and dedication, they continued to self-mow down on the same roads. Here we see, for example, almost 33,000 dead in the States in 1940. Is it a lot or a little? On the one hand, definitely up to the dick. It turns out that the small town was drunk by the whole composition. But how much does it matter? After all, in order to perceive the numbers normally, they need to be compared with something. If no one had ever compared anything with anything, then the owners of 10 centimeters would smile much more often. Actually, that's why I'm so sad. Let's take the UC for comparison. If we open the statistics for Britain, we will see 8,600 dead there for the same 1940th year. And is it possible to say that the roads in the States were 4 times more dangerous than the same roads in Britain? If you divide one by the other, then yes, there are almost 4 times as many victims. But, at the same time, you and I understand that the United States and Britain, these are different countries, at least by the number of the population, and 33,000 deaths relative to the total population of the United States, and 8,600 deaths relative to the total population of Britain are different figures. So let's calculate it a little differently. Statistics, that take into account the volume of the population are called social risks. This is when they count a certain number of deaths or, for example, diseases per 100,000 people. If we count this way, then in the States in the 40s, 24 as many as 91/100ths of a person per 100,000 people died on the roads, since the total population was something like 132 million. And in the UK at the time of the 40th year, there were about 47.5 million people. And if we divide the number of deaths by the population, we get the figure of 18 deaths on the roads per 100,000 people. And here we already see that the difference is not so dramatic. Not 4 times, but even less than 1.5 times. And here we understand that the statistics of social risk, when they count something for 100,000 people, more accurately shows the situation. But the Americans, in the case of cars, went further. After all, it is necessary to take into account not only the volume of the population, but also the volume of cars. And most importantly, how these cars are used by these people. After all, cars are used differently in each country. Somewhere they are used mostly for short trips, as in Europe, for example, and somewhere in the same states. Cars are used for longer trips, since their distances are different, and cities, as a rule, are a huge one-story suburb with a private sector and a center where everyone constantly goes. Therefore, in fact, the average daily mileage in different parts of the world is different. And that's how Americans started counting. They started counting the number of deaths per 100 million miles run. After all, knowing such an indicator, it becomes immediately clear whether the risk of death of one individual person decreases during his average trip on public roads or not. Since this indicator takes into account both the entire fleet and the pattern from the use of the car. And that's why I'm telling you all this. Once again, we open the graph of absolute mortality on US roads and see this terrifying line that goes up. But we impose a social risk graph on it, which takes into account the volume of the population, and we see that it is not growing so rapidly, since the population in the States was also growing, and the risk of a single citizen of the country was not growing as rapidly as the total number of victims on the roads. And if you and I build a graph of deaths relative to mileage, then we will see this line, which has been declining from year to year. And this means that almost every year, the average trip became safer. For both motorists and pedestrians. Yes, there were more cars, and there were more victims, and the population was getting bigger. But each individual car, making its standard average trip, became safer. Year by year, step by step, but the roads became safer. And this meant that the system was working, and all the innovations were working. Each new rule and principle of traffic management contributed to the overall safety. The United States has become pioneers around the world in creating a traffic system, and pioneers in working on the safety of this traffic. In fact, it happened simply because they were the first to encounter this problem. There were no such number of cars in any country in the world. If, for example, the Japanese were the very first to face the same problem in the world, for example, then the whole world would now be driving according to the rules and concepts that the Japanese would once have come up with. But the history of the subjunctive mood does not tolerate. And in fact, the Japanese in the middle of the century faced not a boom in the automotive industry, but a slightly different boom. Absolutely all countries of the world, including Russia, at the moment when they had the rise of the automotive industry, adopted the experience of the States in the organization of traffic. Since it's a fig to reinvent the wheel, when I spied on a neighbor and did about the same thing, only adapting it to my reality. In every country in the world, the jump in road deaths after the car boom was shorter than in the States, as it was possible to make decisions faster and introduce proven and effective methods faster. In absolutely every country in the world, at the moment when there was a boom in car sales, mortality statistics immediately took off. The only question was how long she would be at a high level, until it starts to decline. And the further along the history, the shorter this period is, since each new country into which the automotive world world bursts with its feet had a larger set of tools and proven solutions than the countries that stood at the origins, while Europe was pulling on its roads principles that had long worked in the States. For example, in the UC, the first official pedestrian crossing appeared only in 1951 year. By this time, the United States was already working on the next steps. In the 50s, a huge national project was launched in the States to build modern roads and highways throughout the country. And besides the fact that it was just necessary to lay a roadbed in all major cities and states, people understood that they needed to think about the safety of these roads, including, since the old-style roads were dangerous in themselves, curbs and fences began to appear on dangerous turns or cliffs, which prevented the dangerous departure of the car from the road or there into the oncoming lane. Lighting, markings, and interchanges began to appear, which, purely because of their design, reduced the likelihood of a serious collision. For example, this is how you do it casually. What do you think? Which maneuver is considered the most dangerous of all maneuvers, and because of which the largest number of fatal accidents occur in the whole world? Any thoughts? Well, there's an exit to the oncoming lane, a flight into poles and trees, there was a fight at the bus stop, maybe. The most dangerous maneuver that you can make, and that you make every day in the right-hand traffic system, like ours, is a left turn. That's a twist. Anything that leads to the left is dangerous, if you know what I mean. Firstly, there is an obvious risk associated with the fact that with such a maneuver, we cross the oncoming traffic lane. And going to an oncoming lane, or crossing an oncoming stream, is always dangerous. I think there is nothing to explain here. Secondly, usually with such a maneuver, the driver looks only at the oncoming traffic, as he waits for the moment when he can quickly slip through. And when you look only at the oncoming traffic, it is very easy not to notice any obstacle or pedestrian who will be on the road. Where are you going to turn them? And when you're already so sharp-bulled started, not making sure that everything is safe along the way, you have two options left. Either shoot down what is there, or stop right in the middle of the intersection, in the hope that the approaching stream will have time to stop. Both situations are dangerous by themselves. Thirdly, there is an optical illusion that is associated with our perception. When you stare at an approaching stream for a while, the brain gets used to this picture, and the driver may begin to think that the stream is going slower than it actually is. This is a proven fact. It wasn't my idea. There are studies from organizations that deal with road safety, which show that the longer a person is hypnotized by the flow of cars, the higher the probability that he will make a mistake in his calculations and climb under the wheels. Therefore, to minimize these risks, road designers around the world are trying to avoid direct left turns right at intersections as much as possible. For example, in the 70s, a type of interchange appeared in the States, which is called the Michigan left turn, which appeared in Michigan, as it is easy to guess. With this type of interchange, drivers have more time to maneuver, they have a separate lane for turning left, and the oncoming traffic can better see everyone who is going to get under their wheels now. Also, one of the methods of getting rid of dangerous left turns is circular motion. An intersection with a circle, in fact, is the safest type of intersection from the point of view of human casualties, since the speed of movement of all streams is sharply reduced on it. You won't be driving in a circle at the same speed as you would if the intersection was just straight. Yeah, fuck me. Well, the simplest thing, for an ordinary intersection, they try to make a separate lane for turning left everywhere, so that you don't slow down traffic, and don't risk someone driving into your ass while you're standing on the turn. But still, it is impossible to get rid of all the turns through the oncoming lane. Therefore, there are two simple rules for how you can seriously reduce the risk for yourself when you pass such an intersection. The first, remember it once and for all. Never, that's right, never turn the steering wheel in the direction of the turn while waiting for the moments to maneuver. Usually this is what drivers do. They drive out to the intersection, and a couple of meters before they stop, turn the steering wheel to the side, as if preparing for a maneuver, so that later, when the opportunity arises, just hit the gas and drive off in the direction. So never ever fucking do that again. If you notice such behavior, click on your nose, hit your hands, pinch your left nipple, do anything, but wean yourself from this habit. Purely at first glance, it seems like you're not doing anything terrible when you're standing with the wheels turned out. On the contrary, you seem to be doing well, because when the moment comes, you will leave the intersection like lightning, simply because you will not need to waste a precious second while you turn the steering wheel at the intersection. Yes, everything is fine, exactly until someone comes to your ass. Let's think together what will happen if another car crashes into such a car at the intersection from behind. Your car will go where the front wheels are pointing, and you have them aimed at the oncoming traffic. Don't forget, at the same time, in order to be pushed into the oncoming lane, you do not need a lot of speed. The standard 40 kilometers per hour of a car in your ass will already be enough for your car to get out across the oncoming lane. And then welcome to our cozy and cool morgue. Therefore, at the intersection or on the lane in front of the intersection, we always stand only with straight wheels. Sometimes I even turn them a little to the right. The second important rule for personal safety when turning left. Before you step on the gas, take a quick look in the direction where you are going to turn, and then return it to the oncoming traffic. You will kill two birds with one stone in such a move, and will not kill a single person, which is important. First, you will make sure that there is no one on your road. Secondly, you will destroy the optical illusion of the brain's perception and force it to analyze the speed of the oncoming flow again. Such things. Don't thank me. I am ready to tell you such things all day long for your safety. Condoms, also a cool thing. I advise everyone, especially when turning left. The modern traffic system, which came to humanity through trial and error, is the only system of its kind that does not just serve us, but a system that is tasked with controlling and limiting our behavior in the name of general safety. All the rules, all the signs, the road infrastructure, all the regulatory authorities and analytical centers have been created and are working only so that we as drivers do not do some bullshit on the road. And if they did, then so that as few people as possible would suffer at the same time. In every country of the world, and in every single region, there is a belief that the worst drivers exist somewhere. In the USA, for example, it is believed that the most beaten people behind the wheel live in Texas. And in Europe, they think that the most soldered drivers, these are Italians. And we in Russia basically believe that people drive the worst in the south of the country. But in fact, this is a myth. The only thing that makes one region different from another, or any country different from another country, is whether the local traffic system allows you to enter as if you would shit yourself in a minute or not. And the traffic system means not only the road itself there, such as terrain or climate, but the combined work of road services, regulatory authorities, the speed of response of law enforcement agencies, the work of rescue services, the presence of signs, markings, lighting, traffic lights, surveillance cameras, equipment of roads with dividing barriers, departure zones, shoulder slopes, fences along the trails that do not allow animals or people to go out on the road, pedestrian crossings, safety islands, and so on. I can list these details endlessly, because there are an infinite fucking number of these details. And someone thinks and works on them every day. For example, there is a worldwide Swedish Vision Zero program, which should ensure zero road deaths in Sweden. It was invented in Sweden, but now a very large number of countries, including Russia, are trying to pull this program to the realities. For some reason, a very large number of people confuse it with Volvo's program to achieve zero mortality in their cars. Like, this Volvo will make its cars so safe that even if you want to kill yourself in your Volvo, you won't get a dick. The only method from which you can remove the Volvo should be only boredom, and nothing else. This is the position of the brand, but Vision Zero, and the politics of Volvo. These are generally different things that have nothing to do with each other. Vision Zero. This is the concept with which society should approach road traffic and the organization of this movement. If the official language, then the concept is based on two ethical principles. The first one, this is intolerance to the death and serious injury of people. The second principle, the inadmissibility of treating such accidents as an inevitable evil of motorization. I translate it into Russian. The first principle, in general, here fuck, under no circumstances should people be allowed to get killed on the roads. Here, fuck as you want, but so that everyone is whole, happy, and kissed in the ass. The second one, you can't think in the format that here we have cars, there are people. One with the other. You fold it up, and here it is, smeared here in the end. Vasily Petrovich. Well, fuck your mother. What a mess has spread out here. It can't be helped. Such a life was in his case. It is forbidden to think in this format, but it is necessary to approach the issue from such an angle that you can somehow come up with a squint so that a person normally coexists with cars without this smudge on the asphalt. In fact, Vision Zero. This is a road design program that recognizes and admits that a person, as they carefully say, is imperfect and predisposed to commit unsafe actions. Everything is under control. Again, in Russian, if a person is given the opportunity to get out on the road at night in the rain, bitch, in a black jacket, under the wheels of a car, or give a person the opportunity to fly into a wall at all turns while driving his car, then people will gladly take advantage of this opportunity. You can't miss this. Such an opportunity in life comes only once. Roughly speaking, the concept is such that the flows of people and cars should not intersect, since at the intersection of the flows, someone will always be cut into someone. And in places where it is impossible to differentiate flows, well, there's a type in the city center. For example, the road and the street should be such that you physically could not accelerate to such a speed on it that you can harm people or yourself. The streets should be narrow. The space and fences should be small, so that the driver feels uncomfortable in such conditions. If there are long straight sections somewhere, then you need to either put the recumbents there, or put clubs with circular motion, and so on. In short, where people walk people, the car should go a maximum of 30 kilometers per hour. Not because there are restrictions, fines, although this is also a Vision Zero tool, but because you will not accelerate faster physically, since you will constantly either turn the steering wheel, or jump on a recumbent. And at this moment, finally, fuck, you and I come to the most important parameter, with which, in fact, absolutely all people who are engaged in road safety are fighting all the way. We've been talking about the rules and principles of traffic management here for the second hour, talking about people, signs, restrictions, and all that, but we haven't touched the most important ant yet. Therefore, take out your little hands, where you put them there, and we will touch them. My aunt's name is Physics, and as you know, this bastard is harsh, impartial, and will not ask you anything at all. But at the right moment, he can blow out all your teeth. So, why did the Vision Zero guys come up with restrictions of exactly 30 kilometers per hour? And why in the countries with the lowest mortality on the roads, there are restrictions of 30 and 50 in cities, and on highways no more than 80 kilometers per hour? We have, in fact, all the restrictions are 10 kilometers higher, that is, 40 and 60 in the city, and 90 on the highways. Plus, do not forget that we have a non-fine threshold from above, and that's the problem. And now I will explain why. People in general experimented with the speed limit. They took either a section of a road or a whole state, measured the number of fatal accidents, and the number of accidents with serious injuries for a certain period, and then they increased the speed limit or lowered it, and just looked at what would come of it. To begin with, let's deal with experiments with increasing the speed limit. In the States, the largest experiment of this kind was conducted in 1990, when the guys decided in 40 states to increase the speed on highways from 55 miles per hour to 65 miles per hour for 1 year. For our money, this is 89 kilometers per hour and 105 kilometers per hour, respectively. The results of the experiment were short, but quite revealing. An increase in the number of fatal accidents on elective roads by 22%. and drivers began to exceed the speed on the same sections by 48% more often. In Australia in 1992, they decided to try to increase the speed limit on highways from 100 kilometers per hour to 110 kilometers per hour. The guys thought that they had set up a new model of roads plus a fleet, more modern, safer, so you can increase the speed of traffic. Moreover, everyone is asking. The result is an increase in fatal accidents and accidents with serious injuries by 25%. In Iowa, this is a state, in 1996, the guys thought that this whole thing, which was conducted in the 90s in most states, was some kind of incorrect research. We have normal people living here, so you can safely increase the speed from the same 55 to 65 miles per hour. They did exactly the same thing that the grass did 6 years ago, and we got an even worse result. Fatal accidents increased by 36%. It seems to be fucking 10 kilometers per hour on the highway, even more so. A Perry cuckoo, what's the big deal? But very often, these 10 or 15 kilometers per hour play a decisive role. If you skipped physics at school, then it's not scary. I don't blame you for that. He skipped everything he could skip, but not physics. And now I'll explain something to you as usual. On these crooked fingers, when an object accelerates to a certain speed, kinetic energy accumulates in it, so to speak. Trustney physicists may already start spitting from such terms, but you and I nevertheless will continue. The greater the mass of the object, and the higher the speed of movement of this object, the more energy it has. And this energy is just the parameter on which the damage or damage when objects collide depends. Roughly speaking, if your beloved throws a slipper at you in a fit of passion, then it's hee-hee-ha-ha. If a frying pan flies at you with exactly the same speed, then this is bobo. Aye aye aye. And you fucked up there at the end. Mom, what are you? Since the frying pan has more mass. Here, let's look at the formula for calculating kinetic energy. I know that's not what you came here for. You wanted to have fun. I'm pulling physics formulas out of my pocket here, but be patient. You will understand and learn everything from me. You are a smart girl, everything is fine with me. I'll get something more interesting out of my pocket a little later. Don't worry. So, the formula is the mass of the object multiplied by the speed of this object squared and divided by 1. That's pretty simple. And from this, we understand that the amount of energy on impact varies linearly depending on the mass. In Russian, this means that if there is twice as much mass, then there is twice as much energy. If there is 3 times more mass, then there is also 3 times more energy. But the speed in this formula is squared, and the difference between 10 squared and 20 squared. This is not twice, but 4 times. 10 squared is 100. 20 squared is 400. Are you still here with me? Didn't pass out there. Nod so I can see what's wrong with me. Well done. We catch a kiss. For clarity, we again take the example of a frying pan and your beloved or your beloved. Let's assume that the frying pan weighs 1 kilogram for convenience of calculations. And with the speed, in order to calculate everything correctly, we need to substitute the formula not kilometers per hour, but meters per second. So it's customary for physicists with their joules there. Don't worry about it, I'll do everything for you now. We take 2 situations. In the first, a frying pan flies at you at a speed of 30 kilometers per hour. And in the second case, you live with a professional pan thrower who can launch a frying pan at you at a speed of as much as 60 kilometers per hour. It seems that the speed is only twice as different, but look what happens to the energy. We convert 30 kilometers per hour into meters per second, and we get 8 whole 3300ths of meters per second. We square it, multiply by 1 kilogram, divide by 2, and we get that the frying pan will fly into you with such energy. Now we take 60 kilometers per hour, and this is 16 whole 6600ths meters per second. We square it, multiply by 1 kilogram of mass, divide by 2, and we get that in this case, the frying pan crumbles your bread with such energy. The speed of the frying pan has doubled, and the damage that you will receive after it hits you in the teeth has increased exactly 4 times. And the car weighs more than 1 kilogram. We clicked on 1 kilogram here for convenience, but if we, for example, take a standard Solaris, in which 2 passengers are sitting, and all sorts of shit is lying around in the trunk, it will weigh about a ton of 350 kilograms, and with such a mass, at a speed of 30 kilometers per hour, you will have 46,000 joules of kinetic energy in the car. At a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, you will already have 83,000 joules. At a speed of 50 kilometers per hour, you will have 130,000 joules. And at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour, you will have 187,000 of these fucking joules. And here we understand, since the energy from the speed increases exponentially, the difference in speed modes of 10 kilometers per hour can play a very big role. We return to the fact that Vision Zero has restrictions in areas where pedestrians can walk at 30 kilometers per hour. This is done because if someone gets hit by a car that is traveling at a speed of 30 kilometers per hour, then the probability of a pedestrian's death is low, about 5%. If a pedestrian gets hit by a car that goes 48 kilometers per hour, that's 30 miles per hour, then the probability is already 50-50. And if a pedestrian gets hit by a car that goes 64 kilometers per hour, that's 40 miles per hour, then the probability of death is already 95%. The difference between speeds of 30 and 64 kilometers per hour is only 2 times, and the probability of pedestrian death soars from a safe 5% to 95%. And all this is due to the fact that the energy grows from the speed according to the quadratic dependence. That's what I mean. Let's look at this crash test, in which a dummy is shot down at 40 kilometers per hour. From this angle, it is not very clear how the mannequin will fly to scratch his face on the asphalt, but it is clearly visible that the hip bone comes out of the chat first, the spine flies away after it, and we finish it with a full swing of the temple into the hood, and then the dummy will fly away for some distance. Here's another example, but already at 49 kilometers per hour. Here, the mannequin already cuts his whole face thoroughly on the fragments of the windshield, perhaps even gouged out his eyes, and very friendly greets the passenger in the car. And unfortunately, here too, it is not particularly visible how cool then the pedestrian will land his head on the asphalt, exactly in front of the front bumper of the car. And let's finish it with this kind of video, where a mannequin is shot down at a speed of 87.5 kilometers per hour. I won't even comment. Just enjoy the chances of survival of this pedestrian, and realize with what force he flew face into the asphalt after 2 turns in the air, and everything will become clear. And he will also drive almost 20 meters on the asphalt with this face, or rather with what remains of it. Do you know why such crash tests with the clogging of pedestrians are rarely carried out? Mannequins are a pity. Each mannequin costs an average of $100,000 to $200,000. For our money, this is 7 dashes of 14 million rubles. And after such crash tests, even mannequins cannot be restored, not that a person. And no one wants to break a 2-bedroom apartment in a good area of Moscow, just like that against a car. Moreover, it has long been obvious to all adequate people that if you knock down a person at a speed of more than 30 kilometers per hour, then nothing good will happen. The main injuries when hitting a pedestrian, these are fractures of the legs, pelvis, head injuries, and damage to internal organs. And Unequal measures these loads by hitting these sticks and balls on the car. And they do these tests at a speed of 40 kilometers per hour maximum, since there is simply no point higher. If a person is hit by a car at a speed of more than 40 kilometers per hour, then no matter how soft the hood and bumper are, the chances of survival still tend to 0, since you can't get away from the fucking physics, loads and damage to the human body. Is that clear? And do not forget that kinetic energy works not only in a collision, but also during braking. The more energy you have in motion, the longer you will stop. Did you ride ice slides as a child? That's it. And we all know that the steeper the slide, higher, and with a greater angle of inclination, the more you have in the process, and the further you fly away on a cardboard or on a sled. As a child, my friends and I once took a ride from an ice slide in an old refrigerator without a door. The sensations are indescribable, especially when we drove it on the road under the car. I think that the drivers did not exactly expect a refrigerator passing across the road with 4 children inside. Fortunately, we were the only ones who didn't have brakes at that moment. Otherwise, it's quite possible that I wouldn't have told you anything here right now. We ourselves would have had to guess everything. Such things. So, you and I have all heard such a term braking distance. Like, Cars can stop at such and such a speed for so many meters, but at such and such a speed, that's for so many meters. As the boys and I found out, the refrigerator from the slide on the ice does not fucking stop at all, no matter how many meters. And with cars, everything is clearer. For example, if we take the calculations of the British Department of Transport, then there will be such figures. From 40 kilometers per hour, the average car stops at an average of 9 meters, and from 60 kilometers per hour, for 21 meters, that is, in fact, we get 12 meters of difference. This is about 3 cases of a conventional hatchback. But the problem here is that everyone is talking about the stopping distance, but few people use the concept of a stopping way. And in real life, that's exactly what we need. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Tests for the length of the braking distance are done approximately as follows. You have a straight line. There are cones or some other marks. You accelerate to the required mark, and then fuck with all the dope in the brake. And with such input data, you get the braking distance figures. But in real life, when you suddenly need to brake sharply, you won't know this in advance. You will not have any mark on the road that a pedestrian will jump out under you right now, or a stroller will be stuck under the wheels. First of all, as a driver, you need to notice the danger, get the fuck out of it. Remember that you need to hit the brake, and only after that you will press the pedal. The driver's reaction time to a sudden danger is about 1 second. That's assuming he's not staring at the phone. If the driver is staring at the phone, then he usually begins to react to the sounds of the crumpled hood. But we assume that the driver will figure it out in 1 second. And of course, during this time, he will travel different distances at different speeds. Is the car moving while you fucking catch it? And here is the term of the stopping way. This is just the distance that the car will travel from the moment the driver detects the danger to a complete stop. And here the difference is much more significant. If you drive 40 kilometers per hour, then in a second, until you hit the brake, the car will travel about 7 meters. We add this with the braking distance and get 16 meters from detection to a complete stop. And if you're driving 60 kilometers per hour, then you'll drive about 11 meters until you hit the brake. We add this with the braking distance and get 32 meters. Exactly twice as much as the suspended way from 40 kilometers per hour. But in this difference of 16 meters between the stopping tracks, about 3 pedestrian crossings get out. They are on average 5 meters wide on ordinary streets. This is how bowling turns out. And this story with reaction time and exponentially increasing energy does not work only when pedestrians are smeared on surfaces. These extra 10 to 20 kilometers per hour are very often decisive in whether you will have time to slow down in front of a truck that got out across the intersection or not. Will you have time to slow down in front of the suddenly crashed neighbors in the stream or not? In high-speed mode, every kilometer is important. And therefore, in fact, in the experiments of countries with an increase in the speed limit, it seems to be some pathetic 10 kilometers per hour, and deaths increased by 20, 30, and in some places by 40%. All this is only due to the fact that, in the time until the driver notices the danger, until he starts to brake, until he stops, it may be too late, and your risk grows exponentially, not in a linear bitch progression with each additional kilometer when you exceed the speed limit. And if you take calculations and probabilities into your hands, it becomes obvious that 20 kilometers of the non-fine threshold in our country. This is an unacceptable luxury for which we pay with human lives every day on our roads. This is my position. Speed limits and the non-fine threshold in our country need to be lowered. And the sooner we do this, the more lives of our citizens will be saved. And if you also face the truth, then speeding up to 40 kilometers per hour is punishable by a fine, bitch, for dollars, if you paid for it at a discount. And our drivers take an unjustifiable risk every day simply because we are all actually allowed to exceed the already high speed limits by 40 kilometers per hour. Moreover, there is an absolutely moronic position of the format, but what difference does it make that we have a non-fine threshold? What's the difference? The restrictions are lower. Just don't violate what is written on the sign, EPTA, and that's it. Everyone goes faster than the signs, but you don't get fooled by this shit. Drive by the rules. Or that's what, everyone will run to jump from the roof. Will you also run to jump? So, such arguments or opinions should be sent as deep as possible into the ass of those who voice such things. Let's take a look at this graph. The data on on which this graph is based was collected in America back in the bearded 60s. The meaning of the graph is as follows. It shows your probability of getting into an accident depending on how different your speed is from the speed of the flow of cars. On the vertical axis, we have the probability of getting into an accident on the horizontal. The difference in speeds with the flow. As it is easy to see, the minimum probability of getting into an accident will be if we are driving at exactly the same speed as the stream, or literally a couple of kilometers per hour faster. At the same time, if we drive faster or slower than the flow, the probability of getting into an accident with us is rapidly beginning to increase. At the same time, with a decrease in speed, the probability of getting into an accident increases more. If we take the schedule, plus 20 miles from the flow rate, then the probability of getting into an accident, we will have about 500 cases per 100 million miles traveled, and at a speed of minus 20 miles from the speed of flow, there are already 1,000 accidents for 100 million miles traveled, twice as much. Translating into Russian, it is more dangerous to drive slower than the flow than to drive faster than the flow. Therefore, all the people who say that in our reality, you need to go as the signs say, do not understand a damn thing in the question. The flow is always moving at the highest possible speed. Not only in Russia, but all over the world. Drivers in any country of the world always try to drive as fast as possible. And the maximum possible speed, as a rule, is the border from where fines begin. If the roads are controlled, there are employees or cameras everywhere, then everyone will drive a couple of kilometers per hour slower than the fine border. And if there is no control, then I don't care what is written on the signs. Everyone will just drive as fast as the car and the driver's psyche allow. Therefore, as drivers, in order to drive as safely as possible, we need to drive like a stream, and our flow goes 20 kilometers per hour, faster than all restrictions, since they are not punished in any way. But the task of the state and road services is precisely to reduce the flow rate with restrictions and severe fines for exceeding, if we want to achieve zero deaths on the roads. There is simply no other way. The most recent research and experiment with the speed limit recently ended in France. In the 2018 year, in July, the government decided to reduce the speed limit from 90 kilometers per hour to 80 kilometers per hour on parts of roads with a total length of 400,000 kilometers and install 1,000 surveillance cameras on these roads. This, if anything, is not all the roads of France. The total length of roads there is about 1,100,000 kilometers. In 1 year of observations in the areas directly where the speed was reduced and cameras were installed, the mortality rate fell by 10 to 0.7%. At the same time, as people began to get used to the new speed limit on these sections, they also began to move slower on other roads where the old restrictions were still in effect, just out of habit. And the mortality rate in the areas where the speed was not changed also decreased by 5.3%. And this is also taking into account the fact that in France, everything is pretty good with security. These soulless percentages in human lives, and in the case of France, this crowd of 300 people who did not crash and did not get under the wheels due to the fact that the flow went a little slower. Yes, of course, people resisted. They shouted again that this was their encroachment on our freedoms and rights, but thanks to competent on which, by the way, the government spent 5 million euros just to explain to people the advantage of restrictions, and that they were made to save their lives. People accepted this new program. Who is interested in digging into this, look for the advertising campaign of the French 13 meters. The main point in it was just that these 10 kilometers per hour will reduce your braking distance by 13 meters, which are very important in a critical situation. By the way, since I've touched on surveillance cameras, I'll say a few more words about them and finish with this block. Surveillance camera. This is not a tool of a bloodthirsty, bitch, state, which is made in order to tear money from the unfortunate population, as we usually think, but also one of the tools of road safety. At the same time, one of the most effective tools, please note, cameras are not put up just like that. They are always placed in the places where people statistically most often get into an accident. Demolish pedestrians, lose control, wind up on trees, and so on. If an abnormally frequent accident rate is recorded on some part of the road, then the camera is first of all stuffed there. In our country, not somewhere abroad, but right fucking here, the surveillance camera reduces the accident rate at a particular site by about 30%, and the mortality rate at the same site. 50% if we're talking about the highway, and most people die on the highway. Understand the figure correctly. You can reduce the number of deaths on the site by almost half in one move just by sticking a camera in. Not because I want to rip off 500 rubles from you, but so that you fucking get home. Your fines, in a global sense, did not fuck anyone. The state needs you alive and healthy. You will bring more benefits in this way than you will hang proud on poles and lie torn inside your car. If it were possible to exchange all the money from fines for the number of people who die on the roads, then everyone would do so, since it would be a fucking bargain. See what I mean? In the 2019 year, resolutions were issued throughout the country for 106 billion rubles. From the point of view of the layman, it's simple. What the fuck are you? What is the figure? Or, fuck, they'll set up houses on Rublivka for this money, in Russian speaking. But, according to the estimates of the Higher School of Economics, as well as according to the estimates of other organizations who understand big numbers and big systems, the damage from road accidents for our economy. This is about 2% of GDP. The spread of this indicator exists due to the fact that everyone has their own calculation methods, but that's the point. The bottom line is that the country loses 2 to 3% of GDP every year. Not 2 or 3% of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's GDP, but 2 or 3% of the gross domestic product. What's the point here? Every person who died. These are economic losses for the state. Not only are they direct, since the state invests money in each of us for free education, medicine, infrastructure, and so on. So there are also indirect losses from the fact that you quickly got drunk on the road, and that's all. There's not much sense from you now. And instead of feeding worms, you could work, create products, pay taxes, and move the economy. Plus, there are losses from road accidents, not only in people's lives, but also in the fact that traffic jams, congestion, and all that happen due to road accidents, which also affects the economy in the context of the whole country. The goods did not arrive on time, the delivery to production was delayed, the speed of exchange of goods decreases, and so on. Remember, I was talking about the Romans, and I said that they built roads in order to speed up their wagons, in order to develop the economy. So, this mechanism has not gone away over the years, and if we have the flow of everything going and not standing because of an accident, then it will be very good for the economy. And if we add up this damage due to the deaths of people and downtime here and there, we will get 2 to 3% of our GDP. 2 or 3% of GDP for the 2019 year, that's about $34 billion. Not rubles, but dollars. Since the GDP for the 2019 year, we have almost $1.7 trillion. $34 billion is about 2.5 trillion rubles. And here, I have a question for you. Would you buy 2.5 trillion rubles for some pathetic 106 billion rubles? The correct answer. The dick is clear. So yes, that's right, the camera. It's about money, but not about the money that will be taken from you in the form of fines, but about the money that our country will earn if our roads become safe. Fines. This is dust in the general budget, nobody fucking needs them. But who is needed is you, fool. Whole, healthy and efficient. Traffic system with all restrictions and surveillance cameras. This is not an evil state that does not allow us to have fun. This is a huge mathematical model that is built on money, yes, like everything in our world, but the main task that you are. The entire modern traffic system in any country of the world exists only so that today, tomorrow, and any other day in your life, you get to your destination not in an ambulance or in a hearse, but in your car. And every rule, speed limit, speed bump, or surveillance camera is not taken from the ceiling. They are all calculated, and these calculations are carried out every day on human lives. Accidents happen because we still have the opportunity to get into them. So far, humanity does not have fully perfect traffic systems. Even Vision Zero, which is almost 30 years old for a second, has not yet been implemented in any country in the world, since such changes do not happen quickly. You as a state actually need to redo the entire infrastructure, all roads and so on, in order to pull these principles onto your already existing traffic system. So far, we have the opportunity to behave and drive our car in an unsafe way. And at the same time, no healthy person wants to get into an accident, but nevertheless finds himself in it. And they will happen exactly until the moment when the traffic system will allow it, and while we ourselves will behave dangerously, violating the rules of the road. Sometimes it seems that, well, I'm fucking driving alone in the forest, I'm going slowly, well, I'll push 20 or 30 kilometers, no one will notice, but I'll be faster at home. But the rules of the road are not just some set of rules that are written just like that. This is a safety technique for using a car and public roads. The only difference is that, as a rule, safety precautions. It's an individual thing. Like, don't stick your hand with the production machine, otherwise you'll be left without a hand. But, in the case of public roads, the safety technique is collective. You, as a driver, as a pedestrian, or even a cyclist, are responsible for yourself and for Sasha. And this is important to remember. You are responsible for both your passengers and pedestrians if you are driving. You are responsible for your child when you cross the road with him by the hand, and for those people you can bump into on the sidewalk. When you ride on it on a bike, skateboard, scooter, or that's easier bullshit. Always, being on a public road, no matter what role you are in, you are responsible for yourself, and for ensuring that you do not harm anyone, and also do not end up under the wheels yourself. And the only method, this is to observe safety precautions on public roads, which is called the rules of the road, because they are mathematically calculated. But that's where I can say anything, that's it. I can give birth to the rules, or to those people who invented them. I can show you some calculations that no one really cares about in a good way. But there is no getting away from mortality statistics. The roads in our country are really dangerous. This is a fact. 16,981 people died on our roads in the 2019 year, and in the 2020th. 16,100 people. Moreover, there are even more tragic figures. Death in an accident. This is the main cause of death of children aged 5 to 14 years. Not diseases, but accidents. And in the category from 15 to 49 years old, death in an accident ranks 4th in the top causes of death. Above only cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and sleeps, all other causes of death, fires, violence, suicide, tuberculosis, alcohol, drugs, everything is bullshit compared to how many people die in road accidents. And this is the world statistics. Not only ours. And in any case, quite a large part of the audience, in the process of this whole chapter, could fly such a thought, that it's all of course well painted. What are you telling us? The rules are there, the speed limit, the economy. Well, fuck, let's be honest. You know what country you live in, who's thinking about who here anyway? No one cares from the high bell tower. The most important thing, get some money, buy a yacht, and fuck off in Monaco. People on the roads are dying by the thousands, and will continue to die. You're not going anywhere with this submarine. After all, they only know how to sit in the bushes with a radar, beg for bribes, and to build roads like Kutuzovsky Prospect, where there is no dividing fence, just so that it is convenient to drive in a motorcade. Yes, you might think so. And this is quite a fair thought and position, it should be noted. She appeared out of nowhere, I don't argue. Therefore, at the end of this material, which for the most part was about other countries, and about how the guys came up with something there in other parts of the world, let's talk about us, about Russia. From all the previous context, we understand that countries have faced the problem of motorization in different ways. Everywhere the boom of cars happened at different times, and who faced this before, then you raked earlier. And it seems that those countries whose car boom happens later have an advantage, since you can use the best practices of our neighbors on our ball. But always, absolutely always, the country starts with a wild increase in mortality. If you look at the world map, which shows the mortality rate on the roads, then by the color of the countries, you can see that Asia and Africa are now in full growth from cars. And so far they will be raking the rise of mortality. This is a stage that cannot be skipped. There is no way to get away from it when you start to have roads and a large number of cars on them. In our country, the concept of personal mobility as such appeared relatively recently. Today, in the 21st 2000, we live in a country where 60 million vehicles ride on the roads, of which about 42 passenger cars for personal use. 45 million. In terms of population, this is about 300 cars per thousand people. There have never been so many cars in our country, and this figure, of course, continues to grow, but you and I already know here that it doesn't make any sense to look at some figure by itself. You need to either compare the numbers with something or look at them in dynamics. So, 300 cars per thousand people. Is it a lot or a little? On the one hand, it's already a fig for every third resident of the country by car. On the other hand, if we take the same states that we talked about most here, then they had 300 cars per thousand people in 1949. 70 years ago. For obvious reasons, we didn't have any personal cars in the 49th year. And in 1962, the first million cars in our country appeared in 1970, and in the States, for example, it happened in 1912. For the States, from the first million cars to the present, 110 years have passed, and we have 50. But it is also wrong to count from a million in our case. If you look at this graph of the number of cars in our country by year, you can see that at least in some noticeable volume, cars appeared in our country in the 90s. Until that time, taking into account the volume of our population, they simply stupidly did not exist. People in the 60s and 70s on Tverskaya and Lubyanka walked diagonally across the whole road, not worrying about it at all, since there were 1.5 cars on the whole street. Exactly in the same way as in the States, people walked freely on the streets in the 1900th and 1910th years. Ruble to ruble in the same way, only there it was 120 years ago, and we have 50 years ago. But the 90s happen, and cars in the use of an ordinary person begin to appear at a wild pace in the country. In fact, our fathers, who were then 30, 40, and 50 years old, are almost the first people in the history of the country who could afford a personal car. Our grandfathers didn't have cars. And our fathers in childhood did not look at their fathers while he was there poking around in the garage with his car. It's us, my generation, plus or minus, the first children in the country, who were able to drive with dad to the garage and sit there until the evening, watching him pick at his car. In my childhood, it was first a white Zaporozets, and then a white 8. And dad is up to his elbows in oil, and before our eyes, my generation, and the generation of my brother, who will now have rockets this year, and the generation of our fathers, the roads began to fill up with cars, and people began to die on the roads. In fact, our automotive market, in the form in which we present it today, is only 30 years old. Until the 90s, no one was particularly worried about security, since there was no need. If someone crashed somewhere on the roads, then these were isolated cases that no one paid attention to in the context of the country. In the Soviet Union, people did not die on the roads, not because everything was so well organized, but simply there were not enough cars. If we open the mortality chart by year, we will see this picture. It looks as if everything fell apart in the 90s, and hell and destruction began, which we still can't cope with. But put a curve of the volume of cars in our country on this graph, and everything will fall into place. And no matter what anyone says, but in the conditions of an ever-growing fleet, it was possible to turn the trend from an increase in the absolute number of deaths to a decrease in the number of these deaths on our roads quite quickly. And now, the mortality rate is decreasing year by year. At the same time, it is important to know one more nuance in the method of counting deaths. Until the 2009 year, in our country, mortality statistics included people who died at the time of the accident, and 7 days after. And after the 2009 year, they began to count all the people who died 30 days after an accident. That is, if deaths were counted by the current method until the year 2009, then the graph would fall even faster. Yes, the roads are still dangerous. Yes, there are many controversial and sometimes frankly stupid situations on our roads and in their management. We as a country still have a lot of work to do, and a difficult path awaits us in order to make the roads safe. In order to reduce mortality to the indicators of Europe, which is engaged in road safety for several decades longer, we need to reduce the flow rate. We need to be much stricter about violations of traffic rules. We need to multiply the fines for the speed limit. We need to redo the entire driver training system, and we need to rebuild the infrastructure of all cities in our country. And this is a huge, simply titanic work. As I have said a couple of times in this article, there are a lot of big things being done in the world by small and inconspicuous people, about whom we know nothing. And exactly the same as in the past, today in Russia, hundreds of thousands of people are working to ensure that you are guaranteed to get home tonight. These are engineers and architects who design roads all over our country. These are illuminators who test thousands of variants of lamps, reflectors, fluorescent compounds, so that you notice the danger in time, and so that you are noticed in time. These are road workers and builders who do far from the easiest work, building roads and doing it better from year to year, and over whom the whole country laughs and spits in their direction in gratitude for their work. These are employees of all emergency services, the Ministry of Emergency Situations, ambulance and road response services, who naturally dig people out of the twisted wreckage and pull people out of the other world. These are traffic center analysts who are raking through huge amounts of data every day to calculate potentially dangerous sections of roads, and are thinking about how to make sure that accidents never happen on this section again. And so that not a single person dies on one particular section of the road surface in the future. And of course, these are all employees of the State Road Safety Inspectorate, who face the only task and the only metric to make the roads safe and reduce the death rate on them to absolute zero. All these people taken together are my heroes. Because I'm a motorist to the core, and I know that all these people are working for me. All these people and technologies together represent a traffic system that consists of rules, restrictions, and manipulations of driver behavior on the road. And personally, as a driver, I want to play by the rules of this system. I want her to limit me. I want her to manipulate my behavior. I want more control over me on public roads. I want the system to work because I know how it works. And because I know it's made by people for people. It is made so that the car that left point A is guaranteed to reach point B. It is made so that you and I can live in a safer and more efficient world. It is made in order to live, travel by car, visit relatives and friends, go to work, enjoy the car, and enjoy the freedom of movement, enjoy life finally. And if you want to drive and get an adrenaline injection, then welcome to the places where they are waiting for you with open arms. On the track, special platforms for driver training, and cartodromes, which are also elements of the road safety system, since in these places you, as a driver, must and simply must improve your driving skills in order to drive safely on a public road. And this system is the same in all countries, and it works the same way. It's just that somewhere people went a little further, so they had more time for their developments, and somewhere they catch up. And taking into account the fact that the total number of vehicles in our country is approaching 60 million pieces, which every person in our country uses in different roles as a driver or passenger. All the people who work on roads, which I have listed above, are heroes of the whole country, and your personal heroes. Heroes you don't know about, and don't notice, because it seems that roads, rules, and security systems have always been as if taken for granted. But this is not taken for granted. This is the work of a huge number of people, to whom I personally, just as a human being, want to say thank you. Thank you for making this world safer.
что вы делаете этот мир безопаснее.
And for you, my dear viewer,
А для тебя,
I want to
мой
say the
дорогой
following.
зритель, я хочу
Learn to
сказать
drive
следующее.
and
Учиться
understand the
вождению
car, drive
и
according to
пониманию
the rules
автомобиля,
and safely.
водить по правилам и
It's a
безопасно.
choice. This
Это
is the
выбор.
choice of a person
Это выбор
who
человека,
understands
который
and accepts
понимает
responsibility
и
for his life,
принимает
for the
ответственность за
lives
свою
of
жизнь,
passengers and
за
other
жизнь
road
пассажиров
users.
и других
This is the
участников
choice of a
движения.
real
Это
driver.
выбор настоящего водителя.
It's my choice.
Это мой выбор.
I invite you to a world in which the rules of the road and public roads are not created in order to sort out relations on them and measure the size of your ego, and in order for everyone to be able to safely reach their destination. And I also invite you to places where you can really understand your car and learn how to drive it safely. The only thing that is required of me as a driver is to play by the rules and hone my driving skills, not on public roads and parking lots, but in places that are specially created for this. And there will be more and more such places if we all, as drivers, visit them regularly. Since demand gives rise to supply, we as drivers have to ride trogni. We have to go to extreme and emergency driving courses and go karting to understand how to drive a car correctly and sharpen our skills. And also, perhaps, it may seem to you that this gray world, these gloomy traffic cops, and huge structures made of metal and asphalt do not care about you as an insignificant cog of a large system. But this is not the case. They care about you and your safety. Yes, fines and restrictions, for example, may look as if we are being beaten with a stick, and something is prohibited simply because they encroach on our sacred freedom. But this is exactly the same action as a parent can pull his child sharply when he reaches for a hot frying pan, or forbid him to do something that could threaten his safety. It's not about punishment. It's about caring, protection, and love. The love of a large system for each person, because it is created for the safety of each individual person. And finally, I love life in all its manifestations very much. That's why I work all day long, because I really love my job, and I want to have time to know it in all its nuances and shades. Therefore, I travel at the first opportunity to have time to see as much as possible on this planet. That's why I surf, because I don't feel more alive anywhere than on a wave in the ocean. Therefore, I am always glad to meet new people and acquaintances, because through other people I learn how to live differently, and what kind of life is different. That's why I really value my friends and my team, as we live this life together and share everything that happens with each other. I am very glad that I am alive. For now. Someday it will all end, and I will die. And someday, all the people I've ever seen and known will die, and everyone I care about in this life, change that. Not in my power, and not in yours, unfortunately. But what is in our power is to do everything so that our life ends as late as possible, and not to do brainless things that can end in an instant. This is an exciting journey called life. Fasten your seatbelt, observe the speed limit, and enter consciously. These are laws, but not state, administrative, or political. And these are the laws of common sense, the laws of love for this life, love for yourself, and love for your loved ones. Love yourself. Drive by the rules. And always buckle up. Even in the back.